tiny people and we play with them. Woo, woo. We paint tiny people and we play with them.
Hello and welcome to episode 3 of Miniatures Monthly, the Crate and Crowbar's spin-off podcast about tiny plastic people and also spaceships and also goblins sometimes and so on.
The 3 best things in life.
The 3 best things in life. My name is Chris Thurston and today I'm joined by Tom Senior.
Hello.
As ever. It's just us two, Tom, talking about goblins.
No one else will talk to us about goblins, Chris.
Exactly. So in this month's Goblin news, well, we thought we might end up, going all the way through April, getting to this, latest episode of the podcast without having like a big news. Last month when we introduced the news section, there was an agree of like, wow, there's so much to talk about. We almost got there this time without a huge announcement.
Came very close. Within hours, in fact.
And then, yesterday, Games Workshop sort of formally unveiled, formally announced with some details the next edition of Warhammer 40,000, which has been rumoured for a long time because, obviously the success of Age of Sigmar, despite the initial furore about the death of the old world and the end of old Warhammer Fantasy Battle.
And square bases.
Led to the assumption that, even though, Age of Sigmar has been a huge success, there's been this sort of sense of like, well, where does Warhammer 40k go next? As the game that has, as we've spoken about on the podcast before, an extremely cumbersome rule set at this point that has been sort of twisted into shape that, to the point where it's probably impossible for one person to even know all of the rules for Warhammer 40,000 as it currently stands. And there's been assumption that it will be, that it'll be overhauled and simplified, if not totally, turned into AOS. And this is the first suggestion that is at least somewhat the direction they're moving in.
Yeah, they've certainly led with the 3 ways to play idea. So this notion that, it can be just a purely narrative thing as well as, quite a hardcore simulated sort of simmy tabletop war game. So it just simply, branching out into both of those areas at the same time is encouraging. I'm not sure what they've specifically said yet that makes people think that it is going to be, they've said it's going to be faster, which is certainly a good thing. And, but from there, like, do you extrapolate that hopefully they're going to have a more focused series of book releases rather than just having cross-referencing lots of different rule sets?
So the things they've said so far that echo AOS, and actually probably the way to think about it is they don't echo AOS exactly. What they echo is post-General's Handbook, Age of Sigmar. Yeah. Which was last year's kind of big, it was the point where Age of Sigmar really came into its own as a game, because that's when it gained a point system, which had been sort of experimentally removed, which was a decision that didn't really work. And also gained some better structure for competitive play. It feels like that's the point that they're going to pitch the new 40k at. Yeah. Not all the way back to kind of the mad days of Age of Sigmar, where it's like, if you're wearing a hoodie, reroll all ones or something like that.
Yeah, they've, on the new website they've put up, they do say, or just flat out, there's going to be points. So that structure is going to be in place from the very beginning. But the idea of a more fast, fluid, and easy to understand 40k is amazing, especially because the universe is really fantastic. Like, I love the 40k universe, and I now love the 30k universe, and really well into this now. So
this is an interesting thing, because they've said explicitly that the universe isn't blowing up. That Gathering Storm, which was the event that just sort of concluded, which saw the return of rowboat Guillemot, Primarch of the Ultramarines. Yep.
That's perfectly pronounced there as well.
Thanks. That was, that's a precursor to the events of this game, but it's not going to be a hard changeover between the two. It's more like this is a new chapter in the same story, in the same setting, which makes a lot of sense. In terms of the things they definitely said are, the things that seem definitely similar to AOS. One is that all the rules will be free. So the basic rules will be free. It'll be supported by, they said something like more affordable books, which brings to mind the AOS Battle Tome system to me. And that, and then I think at Adepticon they mentioned things about it having like a morale system and varying movement speeds for different units and things, which is very much the same as AOS. One thing this does adhere to is this rumor that was going around that the way those games would shake out this year would be that AOS would be the most straightforward game. Warhammer 40k would be in the middle. And then the Horus Heresy stuff, 30k, would be for the hardcore.
Oh, yeah.
And that is borne out by the fact that they've actually said that for the time being, the Horus Heresy stuff that Forge World do will still use the current edition, 7th edition Warhammer 40,000 rules. And that might be because, everyone I've spoken to has said that just the confines of the Horus Heresy army books is actually quite well balanced and quite well honed for that particular period. And the units are quite well matched against each other. And, because naturally it's Space Marines versus Space Marines, it fits a little bit better. It doesn't have the kind of mad outlier things that happen when you ally Eldar with Tau and do all this other stuff. So it sounds like that's the kind of the way it's going to shake out. And that's a pretty pleasing cross-section of things.
Yeah.
So what else was interesting? So one of the questions that I've seen going around in the 40k community for a long time was, when they did Age of Sigmar, they broke down the traditional fantasy races into grand alliances. And that's kind of not that difficult to do in fantasy. We have order, chaos, destruction, and death. It's a lot harder to do in 40k.
Yeah, it's interesting looking at their website, because I was thinking about grand alliances as well. And they've broadly separated them into Space Marines, Chaos, and Xenos.
It's Imperium. Yeah, so Imperium. Yeah. So Astra Militarum and stuff are still in, and Mechanicum are still in.
They're in Imperium. Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. So that's that umbrella. But Xenos is like Eldar and Orcs and Tau, who are just like vastly different. And Tyranids, yeah. Just totally different. So I don't know whether that's just the way the website's designed. It's very, it's very tempting to extrapolate a bit too much when there's not much information around. I can't see them really going in that direction. Like, is having a Xenos Grand Alliance? I mean,
I doubt they'll be framed as Grand Alliances. Yeah. I think that's probably the way it's, because the phrase Grand Alliance kind of implies that.
It's not
whereas I think it's more likely to be that, that's how they're categorized. And I would be amazed if it didn't inherit Age of Sigmar's keyword system, because it's so elegant to be able to say, you have a Chaos army. Okay, cool. If all of your Chaos units have the Khorne keyword, then you have a Khorne army.
Yeah.
But if any of them don't, then you don't. And that kind of thing. And that's such an elegant way for them to be able to patch the game on the fly. That's happened this month, actually, with Age of Sigmar, where there are two Chaos big monsters that were kind of left in the wilderness, the Mutalith Vortex Beast and the Slaughter Brute, which are both made from the same kit. Slaughter Brute is a big kind of cornate, hulking murder arsehole, and the Mutalith Vortex Beast, which is hard to say, looks very Zinchian. It has like sort of tentacle maw and a huge swirling portal on its back. And because neither of those had the right keywords, they were kind of unusable, because you couldn't put one in your Tzeentch army without breaking the Tzeentch allegiance, which is so important to a Tzeentch army, which is something that applies to me, because I love that model. And then this month they just went, nope, we just reissued the War Scrolls. They have the right keywords now. So, Slaughter Brutes have the, Khorne keyword and Mutaliths have the Tzeentch keyword.
Yeah.
And that's all it took. It didn't take a new edition or a new release of the model or a new book. It just took, we'll put out a new PDF on the website and through the app, and it's done. And I'd be amazed if they didn't seek that kind of flexibility in 40k going forward, where it's like, technically you could put, because they say that they'll have open play like AOS, where you can use any models you want. So if you want to put your Tyranids down with your Tau, fine. But I would be amazed if there weren't bonuses that you really want for having an all Tyranid aligned force. And that gives you some freedom to put in, for example, Genestealer cults, because they will probably also have the Tyranid keyword. But you're not going to be like, oh, that alliance of Necrons and Tyranids.
It's really fucking weird.
Yeah. So that's really exciting. There's a few little things you can intuit from that website. One, which is something I'm really pleased about, is that it looks like all of the kind of Mechanicus forces are being consolidated into one army, because there is one entry for Cult Mechanicus that explicitly mentions Skitarii.
Good.
So, which is as it should be.
Yeah.
The fact that they were separate armies was weird.
A kind of freak occurrence of releasing those ranges at different times and not necessarily binding them together. I think as long as they make a faster game and require me to own fewer books, then I'm very excited about playing 40,000.
Yeah, there's a really interesting line in the FAQ they released of sort of like what's happening. Where one of the frequently asked questions was, "Can I trust you?" Which is very, it's a pointedly honest thing for Games Workshop to point out that people ask. And the answer they say, of course you can. This is the new Games Workshop TM.
Yeah.
And it's sort of interesting for even Games Workshop to be calling themselves that there's almost an explicit acknowledgement that company has done, by all accounts, quite an amazing U-turn in how it treats its customers and where things are priced at and how accessible its games are in the space of about 18 months or so since the release of Age of Sigmar, which was wobbly. But like now I feel comfortably excited because I think AOS puts a good precedent for them kind of getting this right, that there'll be a certain amount of investment I can make that isn't going to be completely challenged by, I mean, admittedly, they've had to say in the same FAQ, look, you know, the codexes you've been buying that they've been releasing up until relatively recently, the rules in those books will no longer apply. The fluff will, which is a big difference, but big difference from Warhammer Fantasy, I guess.
They're going to stop selling them, they said, in fact, like almost immediately. These old codexes are going to be, you know, off. Which is interesting. But, you know, that's how games work. Well, everyone understands editions and the idea that, you know, the rules change.
Yeah.
And the edition crossover is the point where you expect all the rules to change, really. And I bought two Stormcast, books now, and the old one is kind of a little bit irrelevant. And I don't mind that because I understand that that's what I'm buying into. I think maybe it's just having that predictable rhythm and understanding what you're investing in.
Yeah.
Is really, really important.
Most of this is a point we'll come back to, but like, so in the last month, like, even though based on my current hobby queue, actually working on my Khorne is a little way away. Like, I've got a lot of stuff I'd like to get to first. But I picked up Blades of Khorne when it came out, which is a new Khorne book, because, you know, a bit like I bought the new Stormcast book, even though that's only a passing interest, because the investment isn't, I mean, they're £25 books, so they're not cheap. And they're sort of like big magazine length, but very nicely produced.
Yeah.
Sort of, you know, not mega long, but kind of nice to have. And because they come out at a rate of one that I'm interested in every 1 or 2 months, that investment just in a book, I quite enjoy as a way to keep abreast of the story and keep on top of the hobby generally. That doesn't, it doesn't break the bank in the sense that I don't feel like I have to own it. And also, I'm not buying 200 quid worth of models with each new book. It's just like, if there was a subscription service, like with White Dwarf or with anything else, where it was like, you pay 100 quid a year or something and you get the battle tomes as they come out, I would totally subscribe to that.
Yeah,
whatever they decide to price it at, some discount. But you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
because I almost treat it as like, all of the books advance the story in some way or kind of flesh out the world in some way. So it's just like this month in Age of Sigmar, I'm reading about skulls. And that's kind of the way it flows, which is...
Yeah, I wish more Black Library stuff, was like that. Obviously the tomes are a bit different, but, the Black Library stuff is very, very expensive, I find. And one of the things I've really enjoyed recently was being able to pick up loads of Horus Heresy fiction for $15 as part of a humble bundle.
I did the same thing, yeah.
So I just got everything that was the top tier. Just give me everything. And that includes like audio dramas that are £30 each.
Jesus.
Yeah, and they're so expensive. And it's like, wow, there's no wonder I've never gotten into this stuff before, because it's like the price barrier for me is completely
prohibitive. Yeah. Like what they need is Reader's Digest, basically. They need like, they need a subscription service where like someone will send you a story about orcs once a month.
You know, that's what I need in my life. The Black Library does do subscription services, and they do stuff like audio drama weeks where you but they're quite very expensive, and audio dramas are expensive to produce, and it's obviously part of the, you know, creating those. But I think there's a lot to be said for books and audio dramas as a gateway drug into the fiction.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's certainly happened for me with 30k this month, where I'm on the 4th book already, because I just inhale those things and just really enjoy the story.
Yeah, we should come back to that as well, because that's been my month as well.
Yeah, we'll come back to the month in review.
The other thing I wanted, in terms of, I mean, people getting over the codex as being invalid, that's a thing. So the interesting thing though, that might be a little bit harder for some people to swallow is, a few of the leaked pictures that came with the announcement. So there is a new Warhammer40,000.com website, and obviously announced a new edition. And on that website, there are a few pictures that possibly gave away a little bit more than they were expecting them to give away. Of, you know, I think one of them is otherwise perfectly innocent picture of somebody sat in a Games Workshop store at a desk, happily painting a Space Marine to illustrate. Yeah, I think it's only it was only on the website to illustrate like hobby.
Yeah,
it's great. But the Space Marine that he's painting is pointedly not a Space Marine that currently exists in the range. And it is what is called a true scale Space Marine. Which is something, I think there's been a sort of hobby community around building true scale Space Marines for a while, which is the notion that, you know, Games Workshop's sense of scale, what it means to be a 28mm miniature scale, has been flexible over the years, which you can see if you compare something like I've got one over there, a Khorne Bloodbound Slaughter Priest to like a Space Marine.
Yeah.
That means the Slaughter Priest is like 12 foot tall, given that they're technically the same scale. Like Age of Sigmar models tend to be a lot bigger. Space Marines are supposed to be like 8 foot tall super soldiers, and they're not that much bigger than Imperial Guard. They're bulkier, but they're not that much taller. And also their proportions are not cartoonish, but they've got big heads and big shoulder pads and almost like squat little bodies, like pun not intended. And so what this really looks like is that they're going to do a new Space Marine, like a new fundamental Space Marine model towards true scale proportions, where I imagine those models will be bigger just because I'd be amazed if they weren't Stormcast size, basically.
Yeah. Yeah.
But this is obviously, I think it's super exciting because, that's one of the things that's really struck me over the last month of painting loads of Horus Heresy is the proportions feel a bit different to AOS. Like the kind of way they fit next to each other feels a little bit sort of chunky and toyish in some ways.
Very, very strange. So I've been assembling some Custodes who are just the ultimate kind of bodyguard to the Emperor.
Yeah.
And they actually kind of are true scale. I mean, they're slightly ridiculous. Like I'm not a huge fan of those models actually.
They're massive.
They're just enormous. But you put one of those next to a normal Space Marine, next to a Sister of Silence, and it looks absurd. Like it just looks ridiculous. It's like the proportions, it's not so much just they're all different sizes, it's the proportions are different from one type of person to another in a really strange and unnatural way.
Like the length of their limbs and so on.
Absolutely.
You can even see it with models that will obviously be intended to be relevant into any new edition, particularly, Robot Guillemot, who is obviously massive because he's a Primarch and Primarchs are huge, but we've both been reading the Horus Heresy novels which describe how much bigger the Primarchs are than a normal human.
Yeah.
But he is fucking huge compared to a normal human. Like, he's a Space Marine comes up to his thigh, which isn't quite, I always imagine them as big, but there's plenty of times where people are talking to a Primarch and they're in the same room. You know what I mean? Like, it's not like...
They're not in a tower, and he's like, his head's 2 stories above them.
Yeah, exactly, like leaning in through the window.
Not like the fucking BFG or something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
They're actually...
The big friendly Guilliman.
They all sit around a table together or stand around a table and converse.
Yeah, and they're always
Similar
impressed by
things.
how big the Primarch is, but it's within the concept of a man, what fits around a table.
Yeah, and I really get a sense from the books that it's not just their physical size, but they sort of embody a lot of ideals that, that they almost seem to glow with, like they're perfectly charismatic and they're just like perfectly chiseled.
There's a lot of
beautiful
references to how beautiful Horus is.
They really are.
He's fucking gorgeous.
He's just the most beautiful man. It's a shame if he went wrong in any way. I'm sure he won't though. He's a stand-up bloke.
But yeah, so I'm like, for me, that's an exciting step for them to have made. And there's been a photo of people playing a game with blurry miniatures in the distance, but it looks a lot like new Ultramarines versus the new Death Guard that they announced.
Yeah.
And so, the initial wave of rumors was that, is that the starter kit? Is that the new starter box? Death Guard versus Space Marines, which would, Death Guard being Nurgle Chaos Space Marines, which would make a lot of sense because the promo image for the new edition of Warhammer 40,000 is a Space Marine, half of whose helmet is corrupted.
Yeah.
Which is
There it is.
You've got it right there. So that all seems to fit together. And that would be an interesting thing. I think it sets them a big challenge because if they go with this sort of subtle change of scale, a lot of models will be fine. I think things like Skitarii will be fine. Orcs won't. Like Orcs badly need new models. Chaos Space Marines badly need new models in that sense. Imperial Guard would be fine because Space Marines would have outgrown them in the way that is about right in terms of how they look next to each other.
Yeah.
They've already said they're doing new Sisters of Battle, so that's, and Sisters of Battle are on the factions page, so they're not getting put anywhere.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. I mean, in the fluff, you can say, because Space Marines can live for 10,000 years, they're basically immortal unless they're killed in combat. So that's the reason you can use your Horus Heresy models in your 40k games, because you say, oh, well, they've just survived for 10,000 years and now they're part of Warhammer 40,000. Yeah. They're veterans. So you could also say, oh, maybe, Reboot Guilliman or Robot Guilliman has, they've adapted the Gene Seed, they've come up with like new and improved Astartes, and the new process for, turning scouts into Astartes actually makes them bigger and better than before. Yeah. But they're still fighting alongside brothers from, many thousands of years ago. But the main test is, does that look really dumb. Weird? Yeah, exactly. Will that just look really, really weird? Which is a valid worry. If I had like a huge Space Marine army, I'd be really, really worried about that.
I suppose there's nothing going to stop you. I imagine even then, like, a well-painted army where the models are all consistent with each other will still look good.
Yeah.
And in the moment, at the viewing angles of tabletop, you're probably not going to be leaning down to see what things look like. I guess the danger is if they release some new unit that doesn't currently exist. If they busy themselves re-releasing like Assault Marines and Tactical Marines and Devastators and everything else, then yeah. But if they, if they add something that it doesn't currently exist, if people want it, then I suppose that's a question. But even then, you could probably explain it away as like some Astartes are just tall.
Yeah.
But I think it's really exciting. And I think, possibly to preempt one of the questions I think we were sent this month. It has me eyeing 40k in a serious way.
Yeah.
In fact, that'll be my question. What force would you gravitate towards if you would start a 40k army now?
That is a really good question. I love the Skitarii and Adeptus Mechanicus models. Absolutely love that entire range. Like everything that exists in those ranges, I would buy and paint.
So am I right now? Tom Walton is blushing.
Oh, did he design those?
Yeah.
Oh man, they're so good.
Oh, you didn't know that?
No, I didn't know Tom did those. Man, fucking hell, they're so good. My
I
friend,
think he did the vehicles. I think he did all the vehicles.
oh man, the walkers and stuff.
Yeah.
Ah, awesome.
Shout out to Games Workshop's Tom Walton.
Yeah,
there.
yeah, fantastic. So my friend, very generously gave me a box of, like Skitarii Vanguard, which I'm going to paint up for if I ever play, another piece of news this month is, of course, the
Shadow War
Armageddon. And I've got a box there and I want to create a warband for that and do it in kind of John Blanche colours, just like trying kind of watercolory, pale, orangey, browny robes and like really getting into like dull bronze metallics and stuff.
Yeah. That sounds cool.
Yeah, and so I'd be tempted to flesh that out into a 40k army. Otherwise, I would actually like to have a Space Marine army. I do really like the Space Marines.
What chapter would you do?
Good question. That's a very good question. I used to like the Crimson Fists, but they've kind of drifted out of concern now. I've come round to the Ultramarines in a way, thanks to the latest fiction and also reading the Horus Heresy, like what they've always stood for is kind of what I would stand for if I was
reasonable Marines.
Yeah, just completely reasonable, really tactically sharp. I want to find an equivalent for the Emperor's Children. Obviously, Emperor's Children went wrong, but they were like
spoilers for the Horus Heresy.
Purple and gold, really ostentatious, but they were just like they're tactical masters. They see war as a form of beauty, and it's about tactical execution and perfect formations, and just a conflict being over in 3 hours because they were just so perfectly organized, orchestrated assaults like that. I'm not sure there is a 40k faction that necessarily matches up to that, but that's the kind of Space Marine fantasy I enjoy the most. And maybe the Ultramarines are closest to that.
I was thinking about this because I had the same thought. Like if they do New Range Space Marines, I'd be tempted. I thought I would go for Imperial Fists.
Yeah, they're cool.
Because, one, yellow is just a striking colour that you don't see very often. It'd be paint to paint, but, they're interesting. Two is I like the notion that they are the sort of the castle builders of the fortress builders of the Space Marines, that they, specialize in this defensive form of warfare. Partly because it's very different to how I'm playing a lot of other games at the moment. But also because there are many, many, many things I really like about, Horus Rising, which is Dan Abnett's first novel in the Horus Heresy series. But there is a bit at the very beginning where, partly, of all of the Primarchs, Dawn is one of the kind of like just chill ass Primarchs.
It really is.
There's a mix, they come in different flavors, the Primarchs, and Horus is one of the chill ass Primarchs as well, to be fair, when we get onto this. But Dawn is like, he's one of the, it's alright, man. You can, call me Alan or whatever it is. Rogel. Call me Rogel. Call me Roger. But there's a great bit at the beginning, and I've forgotten, it's a important character. He comes back. One of, Dawn's, seneschals, one of the two Marines that follow him around, is having a conversation, with Garviel Loken, who's the protagonist of that whole thing about, and Loken's whole thing is saying, I think, we're during the Great Crusade now. I think the Imperium is only going to go in one direction, and that's towards peace. The goal of the Astartes is to make the Astartes irrelevant. That one day we won't be necessary, and it's necessary for us to read and know things about civil life, because one day the war will end. And I've totally forgotten the guy's name, but he clocks and says, "No, I believe that in the future there will be only war." And at that point, I kind of wanted little, and then there was a round of applause from the back.
That guy was great. The Imperial Fists are just fiercely pragmatic as well.
Yeah, but also he speaks only in Warhammer 40k marketing.
In the grim darkness of the future.
Yeah. And ever since then I've nope, I'm gonna Imperial Fists now.
Yeah, they're cool. They're okay.
The other thing I might do is, just keep going with Thousand Suns. Thousand Suns are definitely my favorite chapter of Space Marines. And that's not just because of my thing for Tzeentch. It's because I love everything about their story. I love who they were in the Horus Heresy and how they fit into that fiction.
Yeah, definitely.
But they are probably the other chapter. It's interesting. They're the other chapter that gets things done with the minimum amount of force in the traditional way. They will happily just, cast one spell to pacify a planet with their psychic powers rather than ever commit boots to the ground. They're a minimum force kind of way, which is probably why the Space Wolves hate them so much. It's interesting that all of the kind of minimal force tactical masters fell.
yeah, they really did.
But yeah, so I even love the idea of the Rubric Marines, and that's a kind of cool tragedy. Ahriman is probably one of my favorite characters in Warhammer generally. So
The new, kind of, 40k Rubik Marine kind of priests they released fantastic models as well with their staffs and all the...
And the cool thing is all of my demons from AOS come
Yeah, of
straight
course.
over.
Yeah,
so
that's
I'd
really
already have a big chunk of the force anyway.
Yeah.
So maybe that just happens generally. I think the thing putting me off is that, part of me would like to branch out slightly from being like fucking Zinch fan number one. But also like I painted a lot of blue and gold and gold trim and that kind of thing. And
Yeah.
it, maybe I'll need a bit of a break from it, but we'll see. The other thing I'm thinking about doing is Imperial Knights. Like just keeping collecting Night Wardens and just building up a little household knight.
They are
thing.
great models.
Yeah, and that appeals to me because there's nothing like that in AOS really, where
That's
you just build three big models and you're done. That's very appealing.
I think, the one thing that would stop me from collecting Ultramarines is, the shade of blue they are, which is a really weird thing to say, but I find it really boring, like sort of cornflowery, slightly dark obviously, but just really kind of boring looking. So if I could adapt that to almost like, the Stormcast are great because they use Cantor blue, which is really dark.
Yeah, it's Macragge instead of Cantor, obviously.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's like a really dark, rich colour. So if I had the freedom to paint my Ultramarines in a better flavour of blue, then I think I might collect some Ultramarines, which is a really facile reason. But there you go.
That's exciting. You mentioned Shadow War Armageddon, which,
Oh, of course.
which is probably the other part of this month's news, even though it's the previous part of the month. So it's basically new Necromunda. The rules are a lot like Necromunda. This is urban combat in the 40k universe intended to be playing over, campaigns where death is permanent for your small warband and where you gain resources that allow you to reinvest in your warband and so on. I never really actually played Necromunda. I was a Mordheim kid.
Yeah, me too.
But this appeals. One of the things that was notable about it is they released it as a big box set with quite a lot of the new terrain, which looks great. It was like a £90 box, but if you bought that, you got everything at quite a big discount. You got like a Space Marine Scout Force, a Orc Force, and probably about 100 odd quid's worth of terrain straight up. That sold out immediately. It sold out in 10 minutes.
Yeah.
And there was some fan furore, but as a result, they have already kind of updated and turned around the rulebook, which comes out next week
Fantastic.
as a standalone book. Again, that 25 quid price point for a standalone book.
And you can buy the scenery separately, can't you?
Yes, yeah. But the thing that occurred to me is that, like, I'm actually really happy that it's happened this way around because I only kind of want the rules for now. Like, I don't really know what warband I'd like to collect yet. I have some ideas.
Yeah.
I really like the idea of playing it, but also I've got enough hobby projects. Like, if it means painting 5 or 6 models to play, fine. But I don't aspire to keep, store, or own a huge set of urban 40k terrain.
Yeah.
Really. That's the kind of thing I'd happily go to a club for. Right?
Go to the local games workshop.
Yep, go out to Bristol where we play sometimes, like use their terrain, like
Yeah,
there's
sure.
plenty of ways to do it. That's the thing that I think clubs have gotten really good at solving, like the problem of a terrain having your own versus sharing versus whatever. So just getting the book and then, essentially the book and basically any box of 40k infantry for any of the supported factions will be enough to get a warband going.
Yeah.
And that's exciting to me, I think.
That's brilliant. I think the problem I had with the starting set was that, didn't like any of the models that were in it. The Orcs are super old and the Scouts are super old as well.
I've got these two, huge boxes, cardboard boxes from my childhood. We had loads of old models in. Those Orcs are in there.
Right.
Which means those Orc models are old.
They go way, way back.
I think it's like one of the first Orc plastic kits.
So, the scenery is fantastic, but I wasn't going to drop £90 without caring about any of the actual characters or models. And I don't really want Scouts.
I don't like those old Scout models. I'd love to see them updated.
Yes, absolutely. So yeah, I love the idea of them bringing back like small faction games where I can have my Skitarii or Adeptus Mechanicus project and just lavish loads of attention on like a few models and really kind of care about it.
Yeah. The thing I'm thinking of doing is picking up a box of Harlequins.
Oh, nice.
That was the thing I was thinking about. I don't want to add another project because I've got so much on, but, I really love the Harlequin models. I haven't done anything Elfy or Eldari ever. And I had this idea of doing, I would never do a Harlequin army because I think it would drive me mad because these are the fanciest Eldar of all the Eldar.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But what it would be is to have each of them dressed differently, like rather than have a uniform style for each of them. You don't need to do that with Harlequins.
No.
Would be to set like a really strong color scheme for each individual model and have each of them express something different, but based on like, kind of like, there's a lot of like alt pop and kind of like electro pop that I quite like, sort of trippy music videos and things like that. And like basically a very 80s revivalist
No, that'd be
kind of
perfect
like,
Yeah.
color scheme for Harlequin specifically, because they're very 80s, like in the way their color schemes tend to come together.
And I think that's such a good fit for what's basically sort of Necromunda. And like part of me is a bit sad they didn't kind of go into the punk, like this proper cyberpunk thing that original Necromunda was going for, where it was just, augmented brutes with terrible haircuts in like bright colours and stuff like that. And I completely understand. And it is actually probably a better decision to let people just use their 40k models rather than come up with this whole separate range and aesthetic. But Harlequins are a great window for you to channel that again.
Basically, yeah, I guess what I mean is like looking at sort of music video fashion in a particular direction, looking at like cyberpunk fashion and that kind of thing, and like actually planning every outfit, not just having a color scheme and painting it, but like each of them has like a thing and a color scheme that might be a little bit unusual. And I really like that idea.
Loads of scope for conversions for any warband like that as well, which is what Mordheimers are good at.
Well, I mean, the Harlequin kit's one of the very few where it comes with enough parts to swap out that you can make them all female or all male or whatever, which is nice. I mean, I think most kits should be like that ideally. So that's the thought. I've got the book on pre-order because I'm just kind of curious to see it. But it's nice knowing that it's a game where I can just pick up one box of stuff and paint that, and then we can go and play and it's done. Yeah. Rather than, being a commitment on quite the scale that some of the other stuff seems to be.
It's always fun to go down to the local GW as well.
Yeah.
Use their terrain.
Yeah, I would be amazed if they weren't investing big in it. Because this was, I think, ahead of 40k's revival, this was the sort of way into 40k for people. Like, I mean, I guess if they hadn't announced 40k 8th edition yesterday, I probably would have been saying, this feels like my way into 40k when I don't want to get into the mess that the game has become. So yeah, it's exciting.
Awesome.
So I think obviously there's a very Games Workshop-y news section.
Yeah, I believe again it's an unprecedentedly packed news segment.
Yeah, we didn't even, Caradron and Overlords are out. Space Force, they're coming out. I suppose you haven't seen much more of them yet, but apart from the models are real nice.
Yeah,
and the rules are cool. There's rules for vehicles basically in AOS now.
Yeah,
transports.
Transports. Yeah, interesting.
Blimps. There's been one thing I guess is sort of half news because it came out yesterday. Podcast voice, or very soon. No, it's this week actually. So this would be a slight diversion. But while I was at, and this maybe segues into what we've been doing this month because it was right at the beginning of this month for me. I was at Rezzed. And I played Rune Wars, which is Fantasy Flight's tabletop battle game.
Oh, yeah.
That thing. And so, Fantasy Flight are obviously the makers of a lot of games that I love, like X-Wing. And I was, a friend, I think who listens to the pod, Tom, suggested that we go and play the demo of Rune Wars, and I went down and played it. And this is, so if internet rumors are to be believed, it was making this game, which is a, paint it yourself tabletop battle game, was one of the reasons that Fantasy Flight lost the Games Workshop license, because it meant that they were entering space the Games Workshop themselves occupy. Whereas I think they're probably happy to produce those games as long as Fantasy Flight were making card games and things that Games Workshop doesn't make. I don't know how true that is, but it gels with me that like it's Fantasy Flight are more of a direct competitor to Games Workshop now than they've ever been. And the big part of that is Rune Wars. So it is set in the Descent universe, which is their sort of dungeon crawler game, a bit like Silver Tower. And there's a few other games set in that setting. And so, alright, so big caveat is I came away with quite a bad impression of that game. Like I really didn't like it. And I say this as an X-Wing and an Age of Sigmar player. And it is a fantasy battle game that uses X-Wing style dials and movement templates to kind of judge units moving around, which is on paper something I should really like. I also wanted to caveat it by saying that this was a demo game with a demonstrator showing me how it played with another person who was equally new to it. So there's every chance that there is, depth and quality to the way it's built that, it doesn't come across in that first session.
Yeah.
However, I would say that all of the games I've ended up loving I've left excited every time I played it the first time, or I haven't been able to stop thinking about it or something like that. That's happened recently with the card game Star Wars Destiny, the card and dice game, which I just clicked in my head immediately and I really, really like it. And it's beyond the remit of this podcast. But that happened with X-Wing, and I've introduced enough people to X-Wing now that I know that when you play it with them once and they kind of see them get it.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful
kind of really sings at you, doesn't it? Straight away. It's got unit blocks and it's got like jigsaw bases and stuff like that.
Yeah, so right? units sit on movement trays that are like 2x2s. And then they snap together into jigsaw blocks up to like 4x4s to make blocks of ranked infantry. And I mean, this is where my criticism starts to develop from. It's a very complicated game by my standards. And I think it's probably simpler than Warhammer Fantasy Battle. And I feel like that's maybe the space it's actually trying to occupy. It's not AOS, which is more of a skirmish game. But is the sort of place that Fantasy Battle occupied where the angle that you charge from is important. It's probably simpler than that. But, I guess my first criticism of it was that I found it overcomplicated, extremely overcomplicated, for what was actually happening. I find that if a rule set means that you have to do a certain amount to resolve something relatively straightforward, like who's fighting who, and there are a bunch of different rules that kick in, by the time I finish figuring out the rules, my mind's eye picture of what is happening in the game is gone. And I've just started to think about the maths of it. And the games I love, like X-Wing and like Age of Sigmar, actually, are quite good at making things important, but not so important that you're only thinking about the maths that are implied by them. You still have that sense of, this was a dramatic charge, this was a flanking maneuver, and so on. So, I can't even get into all of the complexity of how it functions, but the basic nature of it is each unit has, like, 2 dials that are on the back of a card that you keep facing you, hidden from your opponent. And one of the dials, and both dials are like actions that the unit can take. So so unlike X-Wing where like moving and shooting are different things, it's like, or even, Age of Sigmar where you have things that happen in the hero phase, things that happen in the movement phase, things that happen in the combat phase, etc. It's almost like everything the unit does is on these 2 dials. And bear with me when I try and articulate how this functions. So, that includes things like obviously moving, charging, turning, blowing a horn to gain like a bonus, like rallying, that kind of thing, getting a morale boost, getting a defense against the potential morale deficit, includes shooting, it includes, all of these different things. And one set of those actions has, like a number associated with it, which is the order it happens in the activation phase. So in X-Wing, for example, pilots have a pilot skill. And when you activate pilots in the activation phase, they don't move in player order or a turn order between the players. They, essentially, worst pilots go first, good pilots go last, and then good pilots shoot first, and bad pilots shoot last. And that's the way the game works. It always works like that. There are things that can modify your pilot skill up and down, but it's very visible. It's printed on the pilot's card, which is visible to every player at all times, and it's visited on the base of the miniature as well. So, you know, if you can read numbers in order, you know at a glance of the table who's going to move first, who's going to move second. And it's possible to forget and get confused or get thrown out or miss something, but it's always on you as a player. Whereas in Rune Wars, different actions for different units happen at different times. So, this is totally off the top of my head. My unit charges on a 3, but moves on a 5. So it would charge earlier in the order than it would move.
So the unit's initiative fluctuates with its action.
Yes. So initiative is set by the unit's action.
And the opponent's completely blind to those numbers.
Yes. And so technically you could know them all, and I imagine if you're a very good player, you would know those are skeletons. They charge on a 3. I've got to make sure I do something on a 2 to get there ahead of them. But if you're new, there's no way you'll know that. You barely get your head around when your own things. You're still getting your head around, I want to charge. Do I want to charge or I don't want to stop? Do I want to turn? Etc. So the best example of this is, I thought I was going to move a big block of my infantry into position to block a charge, actually. But my opponent's charge happened before that, and I think connected with the unit. So I didn't know that I'd be moving second. I just didn't know. So I was like, I want to move to get in the way of this charge before they charge my other guy or whatever. But then it happens that their charge activates first, so they charge. And then my movement order does take me into the side of their unit. So I was thinking, oh, well, great, like, now I flanked them because I charged into the side. Then the guy doing the demo says, oh no, actually, because you did a movement command, not a charge command, your unit gets shaken. You take a penalty. Right. Because you moved into them rather than charging into them.
Okay.
And so I guess the moral is, if you think there's any danger that you'll collide, always be charging. And this is stuff you learn, but it was very unsatisfying. Like, it was a very sort of, oh, okay. Like, I think any game where you find yourself having to explain to the other player, well, actually, this is bad, often ends up really unsatisfying if that's for sort of hidden feeling reasons, basically.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like I probably sucked at it and I made a bunch of wrong decisions, but I was making a decision that I thought was right. and then I would find out when things were resolved that it was badly wrong. So, like, my internal logic of how you play, I think the speed at which I expected it to move, and maybe we were playing on a table that was too small for it, that's a possibility. I mean, it was using the playmat that's provided, so it's not miles off. But, the whole thing just felt like I was doing like it was a demo game. I had nothing at stake, so I wasn't frustrated or anything. But I was just sat there, kind of like going, "Oh, okay. Oh, so you don't? Oh, I don't get this." And as the guy doing the demo has to explain, well, actually, because you did this, unfortunately, you have to take a penalty. And then like silly things like the skeletons that I had regenerate, but only if there's a spare spot on the base. But if you lose 4 of them, you lose one whole base. So they can't regenerate if they die in groups of 4, which is pure gamesmanship.
Yeah.
Like, that's pure games. That's nothing to do with the fantasy of being a regenerating skeleton army. Like, they don't have like a base 4 non-numerical system where they can't perceive of any more skeletons than are currently there because they can't see an odd number.
It's a very funny rule.
And so again, that's a guy having to say, well, actually, I'm sorry you don't get your regeneration because the whole base is gone. It's good for him that he's killed that many, because if he killed one more, you could get one back. It's like, well, okay. Like, great. The other side of it was, the way they set up the demo game had the other guy's cavalry opposite my archers. So I thought, well, I'll wheel my archers into position. I'll probably get one round of shooting off before the cavalry hit them. But I was strategizing. I was thinking, he'll probably spend 2 turns killing the archers. So I'll get a round of shooting off, but it'll tie him up while I do something else. And then, he dialed in 2 movement actions. So like on the cavalry, they can put in like move and move again. And also different actions have different colors. And if the colors are complementary, something else happens. So, yeah. And so he ended up charging, he covered the entire board in 1 move and then killed all the archers in the first turn. And so I think maybe if that's possible for a demo game, you shouldn't set them up opposite each other, because it's really obvious if you're the cavalry guy to just go like, well, forwards.
Yeah.
And that shouldn't be 1 turn's worth of, fighting. But yeah, so that whole experience I found like, I just found it needlessly it's a shame because, it's interesting to see another company enter that arena that's so dominated by GW, but I just had no fun.
Also, fundamentally, the dial idea is fantastic. I love how good it is in X-Wing. Like, it also allows you to introduce analog movement that doesn't require a lot of kind of tape measuremanship, if you know what I mean. Like, you've just got dials and it goes exactly this distance, and people can't like accidentally mismeasure or cheat or anything like that. It's just very clear. And applying that to a war game, like a block infantry based war game, is a fantastic idea. It sounds like it's just they've almost like reverse engineered X-Wing too much.
Yeah, it feels like it's too, or like, X-Wing was never supposed to get it on with Warhammer Fantasy Battle.
Right.
And create a game with the elegance of neither.
Yeah.
Well, I think, I was trying to be very magnanimous and say, like, who do I think this is for? And I think if there's someone who really misses the sort of traditional complexity of a sort of medieval battle game about wheeling big blocks of troops into position, there might be something there. And by all means, it maybe was just a bad demo, and that happens. But I really didn't have a good time with it, which is rare for me. Like, I was at Star Wars Celebration in Orlando last weekend, and I had a demo game of Armada, which is the game I've always dodged. That's the fleet level counterpart to X-Wing. Yeah. Like Star Destroyers and things. And I asked the guy I couldn't play a whole game, we had enough time, but I said, like, can you just show me, like, how it works, like, for 2 turns? He's like, sure. And we played it, and I was immediately having fun. And maybe my investment in that setting helps, but I was immediately, like, seeing how it fits together and seeing how it's different to X-Wing in ways that were exciting, and it still wasn't overcomplicated. It was simpler in some ways and more complicated in others. And I think oscillating around that sweet spot. But speaking about the setting thing, I think the thing that struck me as well is that the Rune War setting, the Descent setting, it's hyper generic fantasy. It's post Blizzard. Warcraft is is sort of, Warhammer with the edges sanded off to a great extent. It's Warhammer detached from its kind of Moorcock and sort of 2000 AD kind of grittiness. This is even more so. This is, it's forgettable fantasy stuff. It's, here are soldiers of man. They wear blue and silver armor. Here are skeletons from Bad. They are skeletons. The models themselves are quite nice. They're probably some of the nicer models Fantasy Flight have made in terms of just the level of detail. But, I mean, if you compare it to where Games Workshop are at with just inventive stuff and having a universe that you give a shit about, particularly what they've done with Age of Sigmar that we talked about last month, about continuing to make every race mad in some new way. Like, we're not just going to have dwarfs, we're going to have BioShock Infinite sky dwarves. You know what I mean?
Yeah. You feel like you look at, the those sets and you think that setting is never going to surprise me or excite me. I've already seen everything they're going to do.
They announced their first like expansion set, like the third faction to be released for it. 'Cause the first one is like undead and humans, and it's sort of wood elves. And if you just threw some like wood elf nouns at me, you'd be completely right. Like, do you have glade runners? Like, yeah, probably. Do you have like people who ride deer with like thin, elegant looking spears? Yeah. Do you have archers? A lot of them. Yeah. Do you have tree people? Yeah. Like, it's like,
Bet they don't have war dancers though.
exactly.
The mad drug taking, tattoo yourself with spirals and, learn to dance good.
Particularly like, it makes for a pointed comparison with something like Sylvaneth, which is like, we're going to redesign wood elves. How do we do that? We make them fucking weird. Like they're crawling with these like, fat beetles and grubs that, fire acid at people and
like a lot of them are just elven spirits fused with trees, like just half elf,
they look
half
scary
tree.
and angry and the rest of it. Like
broken.
And I know, like, I don't want to come across as too much of a Games Workshop fanboy because God knows, like, I've spent far more on Fantasy Flight stuff and I still love, I adore X-Wing as a game. I'm getting super into Destiny. I think that's a really nice design. I love their pen and paper games. I think they can really do this, but I was surprised by how unimpressed I was with Rune Wars particularly.
It's a shame. The competition's always good.
Yeah, it is. But for now, I think there's no stopping the Warhammer bus. It rolls on and on and on. We should talk about, I suppose the thing we've both had a big month of is the horse hearsay.
Yes. Have you heard about those horses?
Yeah.
They're beautiful, but they go wrong sometimes.
Exactly.
Turn on
Beautiful
their
horse.
Poor Horus. Not really poor Horus, actually. Fuck that guy. These are the emotions you'll experience reading the Horus Heresy.
Yeah. We both picked up the Humble Bundle, collection of books. I'm only actually halfway through the first one, and so you've plowed on ahead. But those, like, do they keep up the quality bar of the first one? Because I was genuinely surprised by how good
Dan
it is.
Abnett stuff is just a cut above.
Right. That doesn't surprise me.
When it still keeps the same characters as the first book. So the characters alone are just really strong and really interesting. And the prior marks are really, really interesting. It's almost just like a celebrity's popping up in your fiction. It's like, oh, it's that guy. And here's his deal. And just seeing, not seeing, but reading how these people react to each other is still exciting in future books. But Dan Abnett I think if I wasn't into 40k, I would read that book and get a lot out of it as almost a kind of stress test of the Space Marine ideal, or as a vision of how humanity could become like a secular, sort of secular imperialist force. And you got to stress tests with lots of different invasion scenarios. And it's actually, I think it's really clever and really, really good. And the ending is great as well. Like it takes it, the Space Marines to their logical conclusion. Like, what happens to Space Marines if they're ideologically, compromised, then surely that punctures their whole deal, that punctures their whole bubble.
Yeah.
And, that is so well realized in that first book, I think.
It's genuinely good science fiction.
Yeah, it is.
Very compelling sense of a world. Like, it makes the kind of the silliness of 40k, the faux Latin and stuff kind of just fit as part of
it's got
fiction.
A really light touch. And also it feels like, almost like an 80s sci-fi book, because they're fighting all these crazy alien species. Because in 30k, what's really exciting about it is that all of the factions aren't defined, so they're going out into the universe to try and spread the imperial truth. And you're reminded that actually the Space Marines started out as being this really kind of secular cult, as opposed to the religious cult that they are in 40k, which is part of the fall in an interesting way. But they're always meeting these different alien species that have just very different, like there's a Tyranid type one, and then there's like a really cultured one. There's like a slightly backwards religious one, and the way the Space Marines treat all these different encounters tells you a lot about them. And they're a lot more complicated than just being kind of brutish, just stupid soldiers for the Emperor. Yeah,
and the questions that the books ask are actually genuinely good questions to ask. It's not, the question at the beginning of the first book is, could you not have left them alone? And the fact that the Space Marine, that's like an existential crisis for all Space Marines. Could we not have done this?
Yeah, and by the end of the book, wow, that it gets really back into that quite hard.
Yeah.
It's really, really good. And also, it does a great job of introducing Horus as a the brilliant thing about 30k is you know how it ends if you're at all interested in the setting, and it's called the Horus Heresy. You know what's going to happen. So it's the kind of dramatic irony of knowing that he's going to fall, and also seeing him at his best in that first book, and the kind of tragedy of that.
And they're also like all of the we talked about this a little bit already, but like all of the Space Marine chapters that are doomed are chill as hell. Like there's a strange knowledge of like the early scenes with Abaddon, and they're all like just becoming part of the cool the Mournival, which is the kind of
the bro unit.
The Lunar Wolves kind of like bro unit. Like we have a flat management structure here at Lunar Wolf HQ. Like if you're chill enough, you get to join the Mournival, and then, we're just going to listen to what you have to say. Like, there are no bad ideas. Well, the only bad idea is let's not fight. That's the only bad idea. But other than that, there are no bad ideas here, guys. Let's just chill out. And then you want that kind of slow pan in on Abaddon 10,000 years later when he's just covered in fucking skulls.
Yeah.
And it's like, you may be wondering how I found myself in this.
Man, how do you go so wrong over such a period?
It stood out to me because, right before I started reading, Horus Rising, I finished reading, I think, the second Realm Gate Wars book for Age of Sigmar, because I've been kind of plodding my way through them. And I find them variously easy and hard going based on who the writer is, because some of that stuff is not good. Like, some of it is a bit rough, and I appreciate that. I think there was probably a bit of a rush to get fiction out the door with Age of Sigmar, because it's creating a new universe from scratch, and by all means, the earliest fiction for 40k wasn't like this, and one of the reasons 30k can be like this is because it has this benefit of having this pre-existing 40k universe, which is already very, very detailed, and getting to explain how it became that way, and invent a lot, but also, has loads of hooks to hang things off, whereas Age of Sigmar is still, a while away from being something that you could knowingly refer back to and have people notice what you're getting at. Like, one day, 10 years from now, we're all going to be delighted by a reference to the Realm Gate Wars in some future Age of Sigmar novel, in 3rd edition Age of Sigmar or something. But it is ages away from that. And there's a very refreshing change of pace to being like, this is a good writer working in a detailed universe. Whereas even the best writers in the Age of Sigmar fiction are working with quite rudimentary stuff.
Yeah, definitely.
In a lot of cases.
It really, I thought exactly the same thing as well. Like, if only Age of Sigmar could be like this. But of course, as you said, it can't because it doesn't have that background. But I think there's a lot to be said for having your main factions be just morally grey and just interesting in a lot of ways, where I think the audience has done that for the Stormcast. I'm not necessarily sure the fiction is kind of is sort of leaning that way, but there's a lot to
hints
said
at it. Yeah. Like there's stuff like the Relictors are always bound to the realm of death in some way, and they always have some kind of contract with the realm of death, but they're not like truly tortured by it.
No, they just love killing, and as long as they're getting on with the killing, then they're fine. Which is sort of, with Space Marines, that's true for them as well, but there's ideology, genuine ideological constructs that drive the Space Marines in their various directions, and that's not necessarily true for the Stormcast.
Yeah, it's not, you can't say that's Stormcast, like, well, why do you need to intervene against chaos? And then like cut to Realm of Chaos, like, stop pulling off all of my skin all day! Like, if only someone would intervene.
It's true, and maybe that's just because there aren't many kind of, the fiction hasn't had a chance to do many more interesting scenarios where the idea of pushing back chaos is just inherently a good idea because chaos is obviously terrible. Whereas if you're in the Horus Heresy, they don't even know what chaos is yet. Yeah. Which is brilliant. And then kind of discovering it for the first time. That makes it like a good horror story as well as anything else.
Yeah.
Whereas it's all in place and there's a reason why the chaos books are more interesting than any of the other books in Age of Sigmar. It's because chaos, like, it's battling itself, so there's actually interesting conflicts that don't have to be
there's conflicts of perspective,
exactly,
even if it's
right,
well, I would like you to be tentacles, and I would like your skull.
Exactly, and even that's more interesting than, good versus evil is always, looks good on the tabletop, but isn't necessarily that compelling a thing.
I think you can make the Stormcast more interesting by seeing them from a chaos perspective as well, where Sigmar is just another god, or godling, probably more aligned with Khorne than anything else. And
I've tried to make my Stormcast more interesting by simply coming up with stories about them that are more interesting, frankly, than the fiction that has been told about Stormcast. And so I know who my Relictor is and where he comes from.
Yeah.
And why he's in black armor as opposed to, gold armor and all that kind of stuff. And I'm waiting for that to kind of filter into the fiction. And in fact, there's been a bit of a lull in releases for AOS books, I think, There was a
Caradron's out this weekend, I think.
oh right,
So
okay. So that's one. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, and then there was they're keeping the pace up in that it's been one a month this month.
Okay.
Because it was Tzeentch, Stormcast, Khorne, Caradron Overlords. But yeah, it hasn't been like a big drop or anything yet.
No. So I'm excited about watching, hopefully, the fiction of that universe move up a level, basically.
Yeah, there's definitely potential. And I think, there's probably equivalent to like how Horus Heresy is probably the most interesting thing that's ever happened in Warhammer 40,000. Because it's worth, even though, we're painting, maybe things with rose-tinted spectacles a bit. One of the problems with the Warhammer 40,000 universe is it hasn't moved much at all.
True.
They keep recycling the same events like the 13th Black Crusade. In the 20, 30 years that fiction's been around, it hasn't really, it's changed, but it's not moved. And Age of Sigmar is already moving. And
That's
it's been designed to move. It's been designed to let them move. And I imagine New 40k will be the same thing.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the fiction they've already got with 40k this year has been already they've changed what Eldar can be completely.
Yeah.
With, the rise of the Eldari and Death Cults.
So I think, I think that they put themselves in that position with 30k. I mean, sorry, with Age of Sigmar. I think the reason 30k makes for such a first ground for 40k storytelling is it's actually weirdly, despite being about a series of events where everyone knows what ultimately happens, there's actually loads of freedom there to keep stuff moving, because you can start that story at any point in the past and tell a really interesting story up to the final moment when Horus confronts the Emperor.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what they did, right? Like you say, well, we'll start at this point and everything about this is going to be interesting because there's a journey here. Whereas when it's a journey into the unknown, that's, I think, always been traditionally quite difficult for 40k to commit to. So it'll be interesting to see where they go next with it.
Is there a Horus Heresy book that actually gets to the final conflict?
I don't think they've gotten there yet, but obviously everyone knows. There's been other stories that have covered
Roughly,
what
they've done the
roughly
overview.
what happens, yeah.
So my problem with the Horus Heresy so far, now I'm on book 4, is that the first 2 and a bit books are really compelling because it's following the main thrust of the heresy. Then from that point on, the book series, as far as I could tell, just broadens massively, and it's all like simultaneous action on like 20 different planets, and this is what the Ultramarines are doing, and this is what the Space Wolves are doing, and it doesn't actually, like, it loses all that thrust, and I just want to get to the point. I want the book where Horus reaches terror, and that story's already been told. I just want to read it, like Dan Abnett write it or someone.
I suppose there's the element of, like, you want to get to the point where your boys are in it as well. So I'm excited to get to 1,000 Suns because that's where I want to get to, right? Because that's what I'm interested in. And then maybe at some point you just read the one that's interesting to you out of that big horizontal conflict.
Yeah, maybe the purpose of that series isn't to, reach the end point ever. It's more to give, everyone who collects a Space Marine army of any description their due in the 30k literature.
Yeah, their victory lap or not. So speaking of which, has this made you more interested in 30k as a game, as a way of playing Warhammer?
Yeah, definitely. Now, especially having bought with you, Chris, the Prospero set, I've got some Space Wolves now, and the idea of pushing them around just as a tactical squad with a leader and some Sisters of Science just to see how the rule set works, I would definitely be interested in trying it.
Something that I realised, so I didn't know this until someone more knowledgeable than me pointed it out, is so yeah, my hobby month has been, from a painting point of view, has been dominated by my 1,000 Suns. I've completed all of the Terminators now, which is nice after spending, I think we talked about it last month, but having spent so long on my first tactical squad, getting the Terminators done in like 2 weeks was like a big kind of like, I can still do this. I can still finish a unit relatively quickly.
Yeah.
And I've, by the time we post this podcast, I will have finished Ahriman, the chief librarian of the 1,000 Suns, and sort of Magnus's second, I guess, who ends up taking on the defense of Prospero because Magnus is sulking.
He's really sad.
He's very sad about having fucked everything up.
He's got really good reason to be sad, though.
Yeah. And I really enjoyed it. And then something I realized is, so I thought I was still going to be like a way away from a sort of legal 30k army. But actually something that I found, because the tactical squads that you build for Burning of Prospero are veteran tactical squads, which means they have a lot more equipment options, they have chainswords and that kind of thing. Whereas regular tactical squads are just dudes with bolters, pretty much straight up. Even the sergeant doesn't have very many other options.
Interesting.
30k makes that distinction in a way that 40k doesn't.
Yeah.
And one of the problems is veteran tactical squads are an elite choice, which means that you can't take them as a troops option. So even if you had 2 tactical squads done, you would be all elites, right? However, the thing I didn't know is one of the sort of rights of war, which is probably best explained as like a 30k version of a battalion, that is quite commonly used for Horus Heresy games is called Pride of the Legion, which allows you to take Terminators and Veteran Tactical Marines as a troops option instead.
Okay.
And there are some downsides to it, but it means that one thing I realized is that when I finish my 2 tactical squads and my Terminators and Ahriman, presuming that I use Ahriman as a kind of generic leader, like a Praetor, like a Legion Praetor, I will be at about 820 points.
Well,
And the model I really, really like from the Forge World 1000 Sun stuff is the 1000 Suns Contemptor Dreadnought.
those are great.
Because they've just this week put up pre-orders for the Space Wolves Contemptor,
it
which
looks
is gorgeous.
fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And with all of that, and that is about, with gear, it can be easily done to about 180 points. So what I'm thinking of doing is picking up a Dreadnought at some point. It's almost to celebrate finishing the first batch of 1000 Suns, paint that as a victory lap, and then I'll have a neat 1000 points of legal Horus Heresy 1000 Suns to either
fantastic.
explain or sit on. Not literally sit on, but just have as a kind of thing as I wish. And also actually there are rules for using a Contemptor in Burning Prospero.
Scenarios, yeah.
Yeah. So that, I think that's something that I don't want to expand my hobby scope too much because I've got enough projects as it is, but that's something I've been thinking about doing in the light of getting into these books is finding the quickest way to kind of get to a nice even 1000 points with my Prospero stuff.
Yeah, that'd be sweet. I think if I was going to do that, I wouldn't necessarily pick Space Wolves because I'm not really into their whole deal. I don't really like their colour scheme in 30k, which is just grey.
Yeah.
Which is good for 30k. 30k feels like it's the grittier, kind of more sepia toned equivalent of a normal.
Yeah, for sure.
Yes. But I could actually just straight up collect some Emperor's Children, and they would fight the Chaos Forces fight Chaos Forces all the time.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Also, you can pick which side of the wall you're on at any point.
Of course, yeah. So they could be loyalist Emperor's Children.
Or loyalist 1000 Suns.
Yeah.
Bear in mind, 1000 Suns didn't want to fall, really.
No, they really had no choice whatsoever.
Magnus used the bad phone.
Yeah. And then they sent Lehman Russ.
Yeah, he called the Emperor on his cell phone, and as a result...
And apparently wrecked his grand plan in
Yeah.
some way, or set it back by thousands of years.
Yeah, because his phone rang when he was in the middle of a game of Jenga or something,
Yeah,
and
it
the
all
entire
went down.
Imperium came crashing down. That's my understanding
Magnus.
of the fall of Prospero. But yeah, so that's been genuinely tempting, because obviously that means learning 7th edition 40k rules, because that sounds like that's the way that Horus Heresy is going to stay.
Yeah.
But it's appealing, because it's,
I'd also just give it a spin as well.
Yeah,
especially with not many units. I feel like even a very complicated rule set with just a few units.
Yeah,
It's
it's
much
the kind
more
of thing
manageable.
where I'm glad I have access to gaming clubs where people know those rules inside out and will happily. My friend Jim, who runs an independent game shop in Bristol called Bristol Independent Gaming, is currently painting up a bunch of 30k era Imperial Fists.
Nice.
So I said to him, well, when you finish them, I will put my 1000 Suns in a bag and you can just tell me how this works.
Yeah,
right?
great. Yeah. Then you can tell me, Chris.
Yeah, indeed. And then we can...
Or I can watch you and Jim.
Yeah, or you can just come.
Or I could just come and fight everyone.
Yeah, indeed. So I don't know how much I imagine with the Sisters of Silence and the Custodies, you'd probably be already quite a long way towards.
Yeah, I've no idea how Allegiance works in 30k.
It's
so
really
I'm sure
complicated.
I'm not sure if they could even turn up with Space Wolves and have that be viable. But they've released a bunch of Custodes models independently, so I don't mind paying for 1 or 2 boxes to get an army.
Well, those Mark III Horus Heresy or Space Marines are now out as a standalone kit for 20. I think the only downside is I found the thing that really set off all of my 1000 Sun stuff was the decals that came with that set. We talked about applying them last month, but that's made a big difference to how that unit look and feels, and it means I feel like they are 1000 Suns now, even though I haven't used any 1000 Sun specific bits on them.
Yeah.
Ahriman as a model stands out because there's so much extra detail that's gone into that model, and it's such a lovely model.
That's a great model, isn't it?
I'm really excited about finishing him, which I'll have hopefully pictures on the blog post for this episode, but whoever sculpted that model has done such a beautiful job of presenting a character who's much better known in 40k as the first sorcerer of the 1000 Suns, as they exist in 40k as a fully Tzeentchian Chaos Space Marine Legion. And in 30k is actually a kind of a heroic figure. He's the person who led the defense of his homeworld when his Primarch had kind of given up, and the Space Wolves are pretty totally in the wrong, at least from his perspective, because they just come to murder everybody for no reason, and they're a loyalist chapter and the rest of it. And his model is beautiful for the way that it incorporates all these like ornate designs and the sort of the Egyptian theme of the Thousand Suns come across in his headdress. But his headdress also mimics the horns he will eventually have as a chaos sorcerer. And there's like little spikes on his armor and things which come across as like that 30k kind of Baroque style. But all of them kind of hint at where he's going. It's really, really nicely done.
Yeah, fantastic. And it's a really dynamic pose and, just such a good model.
Yeah, so the way I've ended up doing it is, his actual sculpt, the way it's designed to work is you assemble him and he's stepping off a torso of a space wolf that he's just presumably killed and trodden on. And I didn't really want to do this because I thought it downplayed a little bit. Like, I think you can show Ahriman in a completely uncomplicated heroic light, and it's actually more interesting because he's fucked. Like, he is so doomed because of what's about to happen.
Yeah.
That him, stepping out to lead this kind of heroic defense of the last city on Prospero is actually, it can be a genuinely heroic moment that's more tragic because of what's about to happen, rather than having him in more shades of grey light. So what I did is I've gotten rid of the Space Wolf body, and it's just a case of cutting some bits off his reposing his foot slightly just so it works. But, I've modeled him stepping down off a piece of marble, onto the kind of the battlefield that I'm using for the basis of every other unit in that force, which ironically is painted with the Fang and rust grey. So it's all, the battlefield is all Space Wolf colours, but actually it contrasts really nicely with the red. Because I wanted the impression that he's stepping down off a piece of rubble or the bottom of a big flight of marble stairs or something. Yeah. To enter the battle. This idea that he's, sort of stepping into the fight rather than standing triumphantly on a corpse. It's a very subtle difference, but I like the way it kind of makes him look like the good guy, which is something that I
frankly, he is, in that moment, they're definitely the good guys.
Yeah.
Like the Space Wolves have just pure bloodlust. That the Emperor has his reasons for setting them on the Thousand Suns, but as far as they're concerned, they're just employed as contract killers.
Yeah,
and it's an opportunity for them to unleash their bloodlust, and they don't necessarily even care that it's on their own battle brothers.
We'll get to this because it's going to be this month's battle report, but there's a footnote in the first scenario, the Burning of Prospero game, which is just after they're finished killing the planet's human garrison, the Space Wolves move for the Thousand Suns, and it's like, yep, they just murdered all of the people.
Yeah, a lot that happens a lot in 30k. Lots and lots of genocide.
Yeah, human garrisons don't tend to do well.
They really don't. In 30 or 40k.
So you think you would do? What have you been painting this month, Tom? What's your kind of?
So I was getting the Space Wolves together. They're not quite done, but I wanted to make them just mucky, bloodied, because I was painting them while also just hating them pretty. It's like, no, I'm not hating them, but the models are fantastic and everything. And I enjoy the role I'm playing in Prospero as the bad guy, because I never normally play the bad guys in these games. And also obviously it's quite complicated because technically they're working for the Emperor, but I enjoyed painting them up as these, bloodied, just filthy, they've landed in drop pods and just butchered a whole civilization, and now they're on to the final chapter of it. So it was fun putting that into the models themselves, which meant, fundamentally just meant using a lot of blood for the Blood God, which is a fantastic technical paint that Games Workshop does, that is this kind of really glossy, sticky, red sort of glaze that if you can just lump and put onto the model and to bases to make it look like gore, and it retains its kind of glistening quality even once it's dried. So using that in along with just learning how to do scarring and little bits of weathering and using Agrax Earthshade to create oil marks and stuff like that, they look completely wrecked and battle hardy.
It's a really nice contrast because I've taken a different tack with the Thousand Suns, but it works. Like the way I was thinking of the Thousand Suns armor, which I've done in that metallic red that I've spoken about before, is they don't wear this all the time. They like books. They like reading. They're spending a lot of time, in their temple libraries, not wearing battle armor. Yeah. So it's almost ceremonial, like has runes down it. It's sort of, and I really like that kind of, that contrast between the two of them. Like they don't look, even though the technique's very different, they don't look like they don't belong next to each other. It's just that they're two different ideas of what Space Marine looks like.
Yeah, I think add separate approaches of when you actually see them on the boards, and the Prospero boards are beautiful. And because the Prospero boards are grey, my main worry with painting the Space Wolves was that it was going to be grey armour going onto a dark surface.
Yeah.
And they still struggle to pop because it's just very hard unless you're using a colour like red, or sand or something like that. It's very hard to make that armour pop off it. But I went with just dark grey and like bloody dark grey in the end, knowing that there wouldn't be much contrast, but knowing that it would probably look good on the board. And especially having seen your forces, Chris, having these kind of like mucky, grimy, just slightly sloppily painted Space Marines, frankly, against these beautiful, pristine, shining warriors, is just the fantasy. That's what it's supposed to be like.
And it's nice because you have that knowledge that like one of these legions is doomed.
Yeah.
And we spoke about this earlier, but like, it's nice using Blood for the Blood God on your Space Wolves. And Space Wolves are traditionally the Space Marine chapter that is the closest to Khorne, and Khorne hates Tzeentch. And so there's like even though neither of them know this at the time, because neither of those legions have fallen yet, one of them won't. There's a sort of nice thing expressed there as well, like just through the way that the models have been put together.
Those themes are definitely there.
There's something I've done on Ahriman, and this was just the first like paint pun was doing the bases in Space Wolf colors, like with Space Wolf blue, just because one, it pops really nicely and it matches all of the art of what Prospero looks like is like blue earth, like sort of, big expanses like blue mist, that kind of thing, with these kind of like glittering marble pyramids.
Beautiful creamy marble, yeah.
Yeah, so I've done both of those things on the bases, to some extent. But I wanted to do, based on the art, the stones and sort of, adornments on Ahriman's gear in a kind of like lapis lazuli paint. But what I've ended up using is one of, you were talking earlier about how, like ultramarine blue is the worst blue. The new Thousand Suns paints they released for the release of the 40k Thousand Suns are beautiful. So, ironically, all of the gemstones on Ahriman are base coated with Thousand Suns blue and then highlighted with Ahriman blue, which is like one of the most literal things. Yeah. But it's nice because it means that this little part of his armor is exactly the color that you're all going to be wearing in 10,000 years. Yeah, which is a nice sort of, I don't know, it kind of looks, it's a nice, like, he has more of that color scheme in him than any of the soldiers. But
he's the one who's going to be directing that force. Like he's almost his aesthetic direction is going to infuse, obviously.
Yeah, it's his rubric. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so, and then there's a few other things. So there's a lovely little detail on that model, where it's covered in, like, both of the knee pads are like covered in little runes, like engraved runes and things like that. And on his right knee pad, one of the runes is the Tzeentch symbol. And it's the only occurrence of like an explicitly chaotic symbol on it. So I've just sort of, I picked it out in white and then washed it so that it, glows on his knee pad. And you can barely see it because it's like partly covered by his tabard. But I like this idea that he doesn't realize at the time, but that little symbol is sort of flaring up as he goes into battle because, he's on the eve of his doom. But actually the reason, you've done the Space Wolf thing of having several of your Space Marines not wear helmets, which looks really good. And actually maybe it does help you get out from above that grey armor thing. Yeah,
it does help a lot. And wherever possible, I used all the human heads because that is a very Space Wolf thing to just fuck helmets. Who needs helmets when you're gonna,
bite someone's ear off?
Yeah, probably. And there's a lot of, I think Guy Gore, who's the leader of the Space Wolves, is probably the best model.
He's a really nice model as well, actually.
He's really good, actually. I think, I wasn't too keen on him because he's wielding a tiny, stupid knife in one hand and a huge power claw on the other hand. And it's like, well, maybe a Space Wolf would do that, actually, if he was just in the frenzy of battle. Him and the Sisters of Science are the best models, on the Space Wolf side. And doing him was really nice, actually, because you can use the fur. It's really fun to paint, like, the fur with loads of washes and to get, like, gradients and quite soft gradients on them. And then have the grey armour and this raging face with blonde hair popping out of it. That works really, really well. And so wherever I could introduce that to the other models, I did. Though most of them are just, like, grey helmeted and fine. I really like the armor design. So I just really wish I could paint a better color scheme onto it than just grey. Like even modern Space Wolves are like very pale blue. They're in like rust grey, which is a type of blue. Yeah. And actually that would pop off almost any base really. But this just solid grey is not hugely inspiring.
I've done all of my Thousand Suns with helmets on. Even though it's in the art, some of them are not wearing helmets, but part of that is because I wanted to echo the rubric. Because what's going to happen if you don't know the background is that the Thousand Suns, because they are psychers, because they're, touched by the warp, they suffer from something called the flesh change, whereas, they tend to mutate. They have that problem that some people have. Turn to chaos spawn sometimes. It just happens, right? And Ahriman is obsessed with trying to cure the flesh change. So is Magnus to an extent, but Ahriman particularly. And Ahriman will eventually cast something called the Rubric of Ahriman, which is a spell intended to purge the Legion of the flesh change. What it ends up doing is incinerating the entire Legion and turning them into, with the exception of him and a few people, including Magnus, essentially haunted suits of armor. So the 40k Era Thousand Suns are cursed ghosts basically occupying suits of armor.
So you purge the flesh, but you didn't purge the change.
Yeah, indeed. So they don't change, but they can't change now. Like they're sort of trapped. Yeah. And so I wanted to kind of hint at that a bit by having them all look like kind of faceless suits of armor.
Yeah.
Like
cool.
they're kind of embodying it before they've even gotten there yet. Like, they all have like glowing green eyes, which I wanted to, it's not, that's not, supposed to indicate anything demonic or anything. It's just, it's the UI inside their helmet, whatever that looks like.
Yeah.
It happens to be brighter and kind of glow. Ahriman has glowing blue eyes because all of his runes are going blue, and I wanted to look like he's sort of surging with psychic power rather than just, in a way that's actually in addition to whatever his normal kind of look would be. But I kind of like the idea of having them be sort of faceless and impassive because they're so orderly and probably behaving themselves.
Just functional, really.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a ceremonial thing. Like they don't, have that individuality. It's sort of.
Yeah, actually, if I'd have thought of this earlier, I could have had like the heads on your sprues and just done like mega heads on the.
Yeah, I suppose the only flip side of that is you'd have some identical Space
yeah, that would
Force.
be weird. I mean, they all come from the same kind of gene template, but
Yeah,
still,
that's true.
that'd be a bit weird.
All like Lehman Russ. It's fine.
Yeah.
Just buy like 9 different Prospero boxes and put Gygo's head on all of them.
That'd be awesome.
That'd be dumb. That's like £1,000.
Yeah. There are better things to spend money on.
Yeah, there are. So is that, has that been the sum of your hobby this month?
I put together a Star Drake, or half Star Drake, so most of the body is built, and it's really imposing and exciting, and the pose is a bit balked. I'm not a huge fan of the pose they've done for it, but it looks a lot better than the kind of photography they've done for that model looks. So you don't immediately go to its slightly weird posture and its front 2 legs. You're kind of more looking at its screaming giant maw. And it does look really cool. I can't wait to paint it. I've also put together some Vanguard Raptors. Who the Long Strike?
That's Raptors.
That's Raptors.
That's Raptors.
And they're like, long distance. They're huge, actually. They're taller than other Stormcast, like, for some reason. But they have these enormous kind of shooty bows that, they're basically snipers, and they come with 3 Aether Wings, who are also built. Birds, as they're also known. So I've just built a few of those guys. And once my 30k stuff's done, which will probably be the next couple of weeks, I want to like really crack on with the Vanguard forces and do my Vanguard Hunters and the Long Strikes and start on the Star Drake. With the Star Drake, what I want to do, they comes with like a few head options. So I'm going to glue together the second head and use them as a sub-assembly to test a colour scheme and make sure that it looks good on that before I, do it on the whole bloody rest of it. So
That's exciting.
Yeah, that's planning. That's colour scheme is going to be interesting.
Yeah. I'm, trying to figure out what I want to do next because as of Ahriman being finished, which is very soon done by the time you listen to this, I'm one tactical squad away from finishing all my 30k, which is a tempting milestone to reach. At the same time, I'm conscious of the fact that I haven't added anything to my AOS army for a long time now, and I really want to get back on that and have something new so that we can play AOS again and genuinely change up stuff with the additional units. So I'll see which direction that takes. So in terms of attempting to maintain our 3-episode streak of tips about painting things, has anything, what would your takeaway from this month's work on Tiny Plastic People be?
Good question. It would be to not let your paints dry out, as loads of my paints have. And I'd welcome any tips from anyone who is listening, really, because I was trying to get some Sisters of Science done for today, and I opened up my can of purple, which is what their cloaks are, and it's like all completely dead. It's just died in the bottle in the thing, and it does happen kind of frequently.
Where are you keeping them?
They're in a box. So we've got they're in their original big paint box, and they're kept on a shelf normally. And I think what might have happened is sometimes the way the Citadel paint capsules work is that you open them up and they can sometimes dribble down the back. And if that happens when you reclose it, it doesn't create a seal, and therefore air gets in and maybe it dries out if you don't use it for a long period of time. So I've lost a lot of paints that way, but I'm not sure that is the reason. And some paints seem completely fine, and other ones seem to die.
Yeah, I found it depends on the pigment as well. Some of them seem to really clog up quickly and need watering down again, and some of them are fine, and
So it's
bunch.
Yeah, it's weird that. The thing I've been struggling with the Space Wolves was doing glowy eyes, which I attempted to do by undercoating them white, and then I wanted to do red, and I don't have like a red glaze or a proper red ink. So I watered down some bright red with the Lahmian medium, and then tried to put it over and scoop it into the corners, try and create a glow. And it's come out as kind of pink. So I think maybe it might require a few layers, but I know, Chris, you've been doing some glowy eyes as well.
I've done them in that way. So mine are slightly, obviously easier because I do have the glazes. So the green glowing eyes have been, so the thing I found that works really nicely, and it can be inconsistent. It's one of those things that I think to get it to look like proper close-up photography good, it's been one of the ways in which I've hit the limits of what I can currently do without trying really hard and going over it a lot. And I might redo some stuff from Arm in particular, but it's the sort of thing that can look good from like a decent tabletop distance, but this technique I think suffers up close. But with that in mind, water down white to the thing that I was talking about, which is like a milk-like consistency, like quite watery, and then sort of let it run totally into the gaps, the eyes, whatever that you're looking to go into. Because what will happen is it will settle in the lowest recesses and be thinner, which will be the area around the eyes, particularly if we're talking about Space Marine helmet, visor, eyes, whatever they're called. And then it'll be thinnest on the top. And then you can go back in when that's dry and pick out just the top of the eye, which gives you like a transition from bright white down on the edges of the eye down to bright white again in the creaks. And if you ever look at something glowing, it tends to glow in the center and then at the very edge. As if the center is illuminating the eye socket, if that makes sense, with the kind of thinner element in the middle. And then it's a case of being patient. So I use Waywatcher Green, which is the green glaze for the regular eyes, and Guillemot blue for the blue. And the way to get it wrong, or the way to make it need fixing, is to go in with like the full thickness straight away. Like if you water it down a bit, it'll almost do nothing. Like it sometimes looks like it's not doing anything. But you sort of run that in, and then you sort of direct it into the corners. I've done this a bunch on Armin because he's got runes on him that are glowing. There are vents in his force staff, his force stave glaive thing that I've done as glowing as well, and that's the same technique. And the issue is if the white doesn't settle evenly, or if it dries sort of jagged along the edges of the crack, that's super obvious, and you need to kind of go through and kind of smooth it out again.
Right.
It's fiddly. It's the kind of thing where it's one of those techniques that looks good if you blur your eyes, but up close it would have been better to do like, if you are a master of perfect blending in a very small area, you're better off doing it with manually blended pigment rather than trying to do a wash over white.
Yeah.
But I found that for doing, for example, 10 Tactical Marines and 5 Terminators, that wash worked consistently well. But the trick was to do one thin glaze and then one dark glaze just into the recesses. And then if you really want to emphasize it more, you can take whatever the shade is of the equivalent color. So it's something like Celia Green Shade for green, or Drakenhof Nightshade for blue. It would be Carroburg Crimson for red, and then run that into the very tip as well. And that does have a dulling effect.
Yeah.
But it's all about contrast, and because you can't highlight it really, you can add some more white in, but then you still want to kind of run it down. I don't know. The good thing about it is because you're ultimately like washing into a gap, it's quite forgiving. You can kind of just wipe the whole thing out and do it again.
Especially with glazes, which are very thin anyway.
Yeah.
They're not going to be clogging up the detail to the same extent. If you look at the pro models, they're just painted straight up, like with the tiniest brushes in the universe.
Yeah, and the steadiest hands.
Yeah.
By the smallest people.
But I am not that, so glazes are very useful in this instance.
It's definitely the thing about these models that I'm happy I can do, to the point where it's like, you get the idea of what it's supposed to look like, but it's definitely the thing where I'm like, man,
If I was ever going to try a competition or anything.
Yeah, if I was ever going to enter Golden
stuff.
Demon or something, then this is the thing I need to get much better at, like getting right rather than getting kind of table worthy. I think my takeaway from doing a lot of this stuff over the last month has been, and I think maybe I talked about this a little last month, but this is the month that's really hit me, was sub-assemblies. We had a question last month about, like, you know, how do you feel about playing without painted miniatures? And we said the thing we said, which is that we don't tend to play without painted miniatures, at least to a greater extent.
Yeah.
Like, not just grey plastic on a table. There's something there to give the models character, because that's the purpose. I would now extend the answer to say that I've realized that for my sanity, painting in sub-assemblies is basically necessary. Like, when I did the Terminators, I really felt the benefit of painting in this way. So obviously painting in sub-assemblies means almost building the model as you paint it. And what I've settled on as now the way of doing Space Marines is doing legs and torsos, then arms, then weapons, then shoulder pads, then heads, then backpacks. And so each Marine is like 7 stages, which sounds insane. But what I found is that, there's a reason that my first set of Marines, the tactical squad I did before, which I did in far fewer sub-assemblies, took me close to 4 months. And the Terminators, which I did in about 7 sub-assemblies, took me 2 weeks. And it's because doing sub-assemblies helps you feel a sense of consistent progress. I don't know if it's necessarily more efficient in the first case. Not for every model. It's not going to be necessarily more efficient than just having everything assembled. But it allows you to finish something, move on, and it creates a sense of natural variety, but also finishedness. Because you can, when you're painting a model, constantly do something different to stop yourself from getting bored. But you're not going to get any closer to finished doing that. You're just going to see various parts of an unfinished model slowly kind of come together. So you might as well do, for example, all of the gold trim, or all of the skin, or something like that. If you're painting in sub-assemblies, you have the satisfaction of going, okay, all of the legs are done now. I never have to paint a leg again. I'm doing them almost to a finished state. Like, sometimes I'll leave it to the point where the assembled model might get like a final round of highlights just to tie it all together.
Yeah.
But like basically done with every individual stage. And then you have the next bit. Another advantage of this, particularly with the way I've been painting the Thousand Suns with the gold base coat and then the red ink, is it's allowed me with the Terminators to spray all of the weapon hands black, which is great because that's the color that the weapons are going to be. So they just needed a bit of touching up, and then painting it was a lot faster than trying to do a black base coat over gold, which was a genuine nightmare the first time around. And then the third part of it is, I know that I'm a bit of a perfectionist, and it really bothers me if I know that there's like a particular angle where if you look at the model, you're going to see up through a, shoulder joint and see a big chunk of unpainted plastic. Painting a sub-assemblies allows you to get to places that are just going to be really hard to reach otherwise.
Yeah.
This is particularly true for the Tartarus pattern Terminators, which are the 30k era Terminators that come in the Burning Prospero set, where the helmet, all Terminator helmets are kind of sunk in anyway, but these guys have like almost like a regular Space Marine helmet rather than the kind of the bulkier Terminator helmet. And it's deeply inset into a kind of the upper half of the power armor torso, which is massive and built in 2 parts, where there's like, there's the lower half, which has the sort of the bottom of the helmet enclosure, and then there's almost like an extra panel that goes on top to fully enclose the helmet. And then there are being 3 sub-assemblies: the first part of the torso, the head separately, and then the upper panel. And the way I ended up doing it was doing the torsos with the legs, like I said, and then drilling holes in all the bottom of all the helmets, mounting them on little brass pins and painting them all separately. And then after the arms and weapons were fixed, putting the heads into position. And the reason that's a good idea is because you can set up the arms and weapons into sort of a dynamic pose and then stick the head in to make sure that the eye line of the model matches up with their weapons, which is just one of the different, it's the thing that makes a pose look good, I think, is when all of, suddenly the eye line makes sense when it's a dynamic model. So the model I'm proudest of this with is the Terminator Captain, because I wanted to do something a bit different with him because my, Sergeant was already like raising his sword in the air in a kind of defiant way. So I wanted the Terminator Sergeant to have his sword down and like be raising this like Volkite pistol up and looking down it, like he's sort of aiming akimbo, because Terminators traditionally have quite static poses. They tend to be like big gun in both hands,
Yeah.
standing sort of stock still.
Moving weapon emplacements. Yeah.
Yeah. And I wanted this idea of this sort of almost like a dynamic flourish or something in that model. But that means having his head over to quite an extreme angle. And so if I hadn't painted the head separately, for one thing, there's no way I'm getting access to the second half of his head. But also, if I hadn't sort of assembled the model in bits and solved the painting problem ahead of time by just painting the bits separately, when I came to put it together, I wouldn't have been able to kind of commit to that pose. Because I could have looked at it and go, well, that looks cool. But there's no way I'm getting a brush in there if I paint it like this now. And then the final thing I did was spray basically the Terminator lids, the thing that goes over the helmet, spray them all gold, paint the underside of them, the bit you'll never see if you look in the model, and then stick them to the top, still gold, and then paint the torso again to kind of make sure it all blended together properly. And that sounds complicated, but it was so much quicker.
Yeah.
Like, and then there's little things like those Terminator shoulder pads are designed to sit quite high on the model, so you can sort of see a substantial amount of the shoulder underneath the shoulder pad.
Yeah.
Again, if you were painting that without having painted the shoulder pad separately, or painted the shoulders underneath separately, it would be a actual nightmare. Like, there's so many fiddly angles, particularly if you go for a dynamic pose. Like, they're basically designed to look like they kind of like rise and fall above the shoulders. Like, they're sort of like dynamic flaps, basically, more than anything else.
Yeah.
Again, I can't imagine how frustrating I would have found it if I'd pre-assembled those models. And as it is, I got them done to a standard that I'm happy with in like 2 weeks. And that is entirely because I committed to doing sub-assemblies relentlessly. And so, yeah, I couldn't advocate it enough, particularly not just because of the practicality, but because of that psychological element of like, I've made progress today.
Yeah.
I never have to do torsos again. I never have to do heads again. I can point to something I finished rather than something that I've sort of just chipped away at this endless kind of endless feeling task.
Nice.
Yeah, that's my tip.
Top tips. I'm going to try some sub-assemblies. I've bought some blue tack. Need to get some like little jars and use. How do you tend to set up your sub-assemblies? Your little bits?
I've got two. So yeah, the other thing I did was invest in a new way of doing this. So I have little jam jars that I bought from a kitchen shop up the road from us. So I can tell you where that is. And they sell jam jars for 60p.
Nice.
Little mini jam jars that are perfect for this. And traditionally they're kind of blue tack miniatures to the base by their feet.
Yeah.
And then eventually you're going to have to take them off the base, scrape the blue tack off their feet, and then probably repaint their feet.
Right.
Because blue tack covers things and gets in the way and gets sticky and gross.
Yeah.
It's not the perfect way to do it. The other way I found is I bought a small kitchen chopping board. It was like £4 for this purpose, just because I wanted something I could spray paint without ruining part of the kitchen. And then I tend to, like I say, I use a drill, just a regular pin drill, and little brass rods, and to mount individual pieces in blobs of blue tack on this kitchen chopping board that I can then take out and spray in one big go. And then often painting them is just a case of either using the chopping board as a base, or what I found myself doing is I paint on like a knife board, like a cutting craft board. The thing with the dark green thing with green lines that everyone has.
Yeah.
And sometimes I'll just move the blue tack onto that and stick them to that and paint them on that. Because it's generally easy enough, particularly if you're painting little bits. Yeah. Because if you reduce your some assemblies enough, then some things are just going to be one colour. So it's just about giving them a coat of that thing. And then in some cases, it's just a question of you spray paint them separately, but then you glue them to the model to paint them. Which, again, I mean, I love planning these processes. I really enjoy the feeling of like, this is how I'm figuring out how I'm going to do it. So every model's different, but it is just, working out the practicality of like what things need to be sprayed, what color, and what order it makes sense to glue them together in. What's
the actual thing you use to go into the blue tack to attach the model? Like if you've got sticks?
Brass rod.
Brass rod?
So yeah, so there's, I think it's Firestorm Games, who I use a lot for this stuff. They sell a kit, which is a drill and a certain supply of brass rod that's the same size.
Oh yeah?
And that was like £8. And I'm still getting through that brass rod. Because obviously you reuse it as well, and I've cut like a couple of rods into like inch rods that are then fine for sticking things in.
How do you glue the model end where the rod meets the actual thing?
Drill a hole in the model.
Oh, right. So you actually...
Yeah, so, I mean, most things, good examples of this. So heads are fine, because they're quite thick pieces of plastic. You can drill them through the neck, and you're never going to ever see that, because that's the point where it glues in. Obviously, if you can drill into the, for arms and things, you drill into the elbow socket, because that's, the shoulder socket, because that's where it's going to glue in again, so you're never going to see it. For bolters, drill into the barrel, because you'd be drilling out the barrel anyway.
Yeah.
a lot of the time. So you just drill out the barrel and then put the rod in the barrel, and then that means that the only place that isn't getting spray painted is the inside of the barrel,
Which is fine.
So I found the only exception to that was the heavy bolter, where because the Marine tends to hold the heavy bolter quite close to their chest. On the Marine side of the bolter, there is like a cartridge ejection port. So I drilled that out, and you'll never see that ever. Like if you get a mag light and shine it up through the Marine's legs, you might see that there's a small hole in the mag ejection port on the bottom side of the bolt gun, but I'll take that.
Yeah, it's not going to work. Yeah.
So yeah, but for the most part, that just works fine.
Cool.
You don't need. I mean, I know that the other option is to lightly super glue stuff so that it'll
that's
snap
what
off.
I've heard people say, but it must leave some residue and stuff, right?
Yeah. For the most part as well, after painting sub-assemblies, it's worth saying I tend to super glue the models together rather than plastic glue them, but it varies on the model and the joint. But super glues, because super glue tends to obviously adhere better, whereas, it doesn't adhere as well, but plastic glue melts the model. So if, depending on the way it's been painted, it might fuck up the paint job if you try and plastic glue it.
Yeah, plus plastic glue can struggle to get through paint.
Yeah.
So it can make for a harder sticking process.
So I think parts of those, also the good thing about going with super glue is if you realize you fucked something up, you can quite easily get to it before actual permanent damage is done to the model itself.
Yeah.
Why don't we talk about what happened when these many stage painted tiny men decided to fight each other, perhaps?
Good idea. We played the first scenario in the Burning of Prospero set.
Yeah.
A mere year after we bought it. Not quite a year, about
6 months.
6 months. Okay.
We got it in October.
Okay,
we got it when it came out.
That's not too bad.
It wasn't too bad. We bought it the day we played our first game of Age of Sigmar against each other.
Oh yeah.
Because we went down to Bristol and ended up picking up the set. The whole idea at the time of like, I'll have this painted in 2 weeks. We'll be playing before Christmas.
Didn't quite materialise.
No.
Though we were distracted by Sigma.
That's true.
By OS.
Yeah, we were. There's plenty of good excuses. So yeah, Burning of Prospero is it's sort of like the sequel to Betrayal at Calth, which was the previous kind of standalone Horus Heresy boxed game. Mm-hmm. So while it is telling stories from the Warhammer 30k universe that have a bearing on the Warhammer 40k universe, it uses neither of the rule sets for those things. Well, it's not based on 7th edition 40k. And I don't know about you, but this is sort of like, I'd basically forgotten this. Like, I had this huge painting project for so long, and it turned into a totally new game.
Yeah, it was really exciting, actually.
Yeah.
And the game itself is quite lovely, I think.
And quite elegant.
Very easy to understand, very intuitive, and a very interesting use of a different dice system for Games Workshop.
Yeah, so you build a sort of battlefield out of these beautiful printed cardboard tiles, basically, that have squares on them. And you can, place down new tiles to represent cover and fallen columns and that kind of thing. The first scenario we're doing was sort of, it's the moment that Space Wolves arrive in Tizca and have to break through the defenses to kind of keep murdering people, basically.
That's what they're there to do.
To continue to murder people. And so the Thousand Suns player, which is me, has to stop the Space Wolf player getting any models out of the board on two specific exit version of entry? It's exit points on the board. So it's about slowing you down. But the way the rules work is it's unlike Warhammer in that it is grid based. It's not about measuring inches between units or anything like that. There's a few, I think, I'll see if you pick out anything else. The things that stood out to me about the rule set, one is, apart from the fact that it's a grid, the fact that, after you move models individually, but then those models form like a combat unit with whoever they're sharing a square with. Every square has capacity, which is like basically four models, but big models like Terminators and Custodes count as 2. So quite a simple system, but you kind of form these kind of like combat blocks as you go, which is a kind of interesting idea because we have this idea from other Games Workshop games that a unit is a unit. This tactical squad is a unit. It doesn't just mix in with some Terminators or anything like that.
Yeah. And
that's kind of an interesting idea. And the other thing that struck out to me is how their spellcasting system works, which is also kind of interesting. Was there anything else that stood out to you about how the rules fit together at the top level?
Both of those and the sort of the change in variance that a different dice system offers, particularly when a crit is a 6, but you could be rolling a d6 or a d8 or a d12.
Yeah.
And how that functions, like in terms of chance and, opportunity.
That's the other interesting thing. So we're used to thinking of weapons having like to hit values. So this hits on a 3, this hits on a 4 up, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
The way it works in Burning of Prospero is weapons have an associated dice. So a regular bolt gun is a d6, a plasma gun is a d8, a heavy bolter is a d10. And then you roll those dice equal to whoever's in that combat block. So if it's 3 regular Marines with bolt guns and a Marine with a heavy bolter, it's 3d6 and a d10. And then the defender, regardless of how many miniatures are defending, rolls a dice for each incoming attack. And then they can upgrade those dice based on the armor being worn. So like Terminators get D10 armor against one of those attacks, depending on how many models are in the unit. It's very intuitive, but there's slightly more to it than just rolling a certain amount of dice. But then all that matters is not hitting a particular value, it's rolling higher than the other guy. So if you're rolling a dice with more sides, you obviously have more chances to get a higher number, but that's all that matters. Yeah. And I've not seen another system do that, make the actual dice itself the measure of the upgrade, not what value you have to hit.
Yeah, it makes for these really interesting sort of army cards. So each army has a card, and all of the units are on that card. Like it's double-sided, but it means that when you have like a flamer, and you just have all you have next to it is the type of dice it needs, and that just sucks a lot of the kind of fiddliness out of an AOS style system, or a kind of war scroll based, or a book based system, and says it's just a dice off. But we're going to use the different types of dice to actually create the statistical biases that makes one thing more powerful than another. Yeah,
it's interesting because it's a more elegant way of. Also, it's more. I mean, to go all the way back to what we were talking about, Rune Wars. It's more immediately visible. Like my gun is more powerful because I'm suddenly rolling a 10-sided dice rather than a 6-sided dice. Rather than it's important that I hit on a 3-up and wound on a 3-up as opposed to hit on a 4, wound on a 5, or whatever it is. Like, that system has its place, and I can imagine this getting very cumbersome if you do it at any greater scale than this kind of like squad-based urban combat that this is designed for, but it's a really refreshing change, I think. Both the increased fluidity and also the increased visibility of how it resolves.
And combining that with the rule that allows all Space Marines, basically, they shed all their wounds every turn.
Oh, yeah.
And so that kind of mitigates spikes a little bit. So, you can get a lot of damage done to one unit, but it only really has an effect on the unit if it kills people outright. And doing like 4 damage into Gygor, the general, is quite a task. You actually need to focus fire with a lot of different things, and that involves a lot of maneuvering.
Yeah.
And it's just really, I think it's just really, really interesting. I can't wait to play with more units and on bigger boards.
That's maybe worth reiterating. So when a unit takes damage, you assign a wound token to it. And obviously everything has a total health value. That means it's dead if it takes damage equal to its health value. However, at the end of every round, so after every combat round is finished, all wound tokens get removed. So anyone who hasn't died goes back to full health. And that sounds a bit mad from a wargame point of view when you're used to the idea that things take damage over time. But it's really interesting. It totally fits the fantasy of how Space Marines operate. They're supposed to be almost indestructible till they die. And so, and it's I really like that as an idea because it creates this, we'll get to it, but moments of sort of drama and horror when if you haven't done just enough to kill someone, they're back, maybe.
And it makes the Space Marines really dangerous. Like if you don't kill Gygor outright, when he attacks back, he just rips apart 2 Space Marines. And in my head, that's exactly what would happen in the fiction, is they don't gun him down properly, he gets into them. And it's an amazing, it's a fantastic merging fiction and mathematical rule set.
So we should get into how this sort of pans out. So, so my force for this was a full tactical squad of veterans and a single Terminator captain, which in terms of, squares occupied is exactly 3 because it's 10 models for the tactical squad and then the Terminator counts as 2, so it's 12 total, 4 per square. You had your full tactical squad, Gygor, who's the Space Wolf leader with his little knife, and a Sister Superior, who's the leader of a squad of Sisters of Silence, which is also 12, basically exactly. So in terms of bases, function is 12, even though it's 11 bases for me, just one of them's a double base. And I had 3 positions to deploy in. And you had to deploy in like a kind of tight L shape in the corner of the board. So I sort of spread out around the board, flanking the different exit points that you could be trying to get to, and you were in a big wedge. When you were deploying, did you have like a particular strategy in mind, like something you wanted to
It
do?
was pretty much to load up one exit. I think I was slightly lucky because you deployed first, as you know the scenario demanded, so I could see where your Terminator was and where I thought I could break through if I had a really strong combat unit backed up by a shooter unit, which is why I ended up putting all of my combat veterans into one square squad block and using that as a kind of vanguard, and then putting loads of shooting behind it, thinking that if I could just overload the flank of weaker warriors, I could break through, and avoiding the Terminator as much as possible, really.
Yeah, so I had the thought that because the way the deployment works out, one of the exit points has 2 deployment zones quite near to it, and the other one has 1. So I put the Terminator, a Legionnaire with a Legionary Vexillio, which is basically the banner, which gives them some rerolls, and another Legionary with a melter gun, so like a short range powerful weapon, on that one, on the lone exit point, so that if you rushed that one, you'd have more resistance there. And if you didn't, then I'd have this quite dangerous unit that could flank you. And then I sort of loaded up the rest of my Marines, including the Sergeant, on the other 2, with the Sergeant closest to you. So the way it works the thing that I think most, apart from the fact that each faction has to access to different units, the thing that most notably makes them different is magic. It's that 1,000 Suns are psychers, and they have access to these kind of like mad psychic powers, and the Space Wolves don't at all. So the way that works is, at the start of the game, I get 3 spells basically that are associated with the particular cult that's taking part in this mission. And so this one, it was Pavoni, which is the cult that's most associated with like biomancy and like mutation and regeneration and that kind of thing. And then I draw 2 more spells at random. Well, in fact, I got you to draw them for me from the deck, like to make sure it was completely random. The way, and then when I got those random spells, I saw that one of them I'd received is from like the Pyri cult, which is the fire cult, basically. And it's this thing called like Firewall, which does what you'd expect. It creates a wall of flame that makes a area impassable for a turn. And I immediately saw how powerful this would be, because I could see what you'd done with your deployment. Even though it happened after my deployment, you had this sort of tip of the spear with Gygor and the Sister of Silence and the Sergeant with the Thunderhammer.
Yeah.
But they were squashed in between the edge of the board and a fallen pillar or like some debris. So if I could block that passageway, you'd be forced to go around with all of them, which gives me time to kind of consolidate a firing solution, because I realize that I have to get close to you. And so that first turn, the first thing that happens is spellcasting. And that first turn I realized like this is a game changer if I can get this wall of fire off. But the way spellcasting works is really interesting. So like in AOS or anything else, it's you roll 2 dice. If you get above a certain amount of the spell's cast, the other player can try and unbind it by rolling 2 dice and trying to get a better score. The way this works is basically like Space Wizard top trumps.
Yep.
So I have a warp deck of cards that have numbers on them, and you have a willpower deck of cards that have numbers on them. And taking it in turn, starting with me, we draw a card and add it to a pile, and the next person draws a card and add it to a pile. And on the most simple level, after each of us have drawn 3 cards, the person with more numbers wins. If you win, the spell isn't cast. If I win, the spell is cast. But each of them a lot of them have complicating factors on them, which are really interesting.
Yeah.
So like the fact that you had a Sister of Silence on the board who's supposed to dampen psychic energy meant that some of your cards were just worth more. And that was really powerful early on.
Some of them have really interesting decisions on them. So it could be like this card is worth 0 or 2. If you select 0 and kind of sacrifice this, then if you succeed in this counter, the magic phase ends immediately.
Yeah.
So you're taking this gamble and saying, okay, maybe Chris has drawn 2 1s for his psychic power to try and cast this. And I've drawn a 1 and now this 0 card. Maybe I take the 0 and gamble on getting maybe a 2 or 3 next turn to win. And if I win, that ends the phase completely. And
Yeah.
Chris
and
can't
really
cast any
powerful.
more spells.
So I can cast up to 3, but I can't try and cast the same one twice, which is a really powerful kind of thing. And there's some for the 1,000 Suns, which are like, you can choose to, this is worth 1, or it's worth automatically succeeding. But if you choose automatic success, the phase just ends.
Yeah.
So you give up on your other spellcasting attempts. There's even though it's I call it top trumps, it's the the definition of a random system of drawing cards to determine success. You get these moments of interesting decisions, and there's actually genuine drama. Just because you're not rolling a dice, you're both drawing a card, and it's tense, like knowing how much can ride on this, and we'll get to how much can ride on that.
Yeah, especially because the spells are like really well balanced. Like they all seemed like considerably game affecting. They didn't seem like duff spells. Maybe there was just one that you just didn't use as much.
So the spells I had the ability to give the casting unit a free attack basically during that phase, which is powerful given that wounds need to all take place within the same turn to kill something. That's very powerful. I had one that allowed me to do a free movement. So a free attack and a free movement are kind of obvious things. I had a kind of chain lightning attack that I would subsequently cast later, which does it does a D8 attack. So it's more powerful than normal, but it's not amazing. And then it also hits any units adjacent to the one that it hits. I had the ability to resurrect a dead person, but only into a unit that had space on its tile, which is a really interesting restriction.
Yeah.
And I had the firewall, which, because this was so much about stopping you getting places, felt like the most useful one.
Yeah.
Long story short, so that firewall failed, which is a really big problem because I knew that then you could charge me. So then, the unit closest to you did succeed in casting the spell that gave them a free move to move all the way to the back of the board.
Yeah.
Because I knew that I would need a good turn of shooting at you before you could get to me in combat, because that's where Space Wolves are good.
But then Gygor said no.
Yeah.
Gygor has a special rule that means if he ends up in combat, he can move 3 squares instead of 2, the normal 2. So he did the correct Space Wolf thing and just outpaced all of his fellow squad and went solo into that unit. And it was a bloody good
Ripped
time.
them to pieces. He killed 2 Astartes in the first.
His first move was just to brutally dismember 2 Astartes, which is, perfect for him.
And in response in that combat phase, I did the thing that kind of made sense, which was just pour fire into this kind of like mad charging helmetless Space Wolf bastard that had just killed 2 people. And I think I succeeded in doing 2 wounds to him or 3 wounds to him in that turn.
Yeah.
But of course, because all the wounds get reset at the end, that wasn't enough. And it meant that I hadn't been shooting at everyone else coming up behind him. So he'd basically done, it's a very thematic thing. He'd soaked up all of that fire coming in and functionally like almost brought the front line to me by the time the next turn.
Which is pure Space Wolves. I mean, for that was the moment where I was like, oh, this rule set really represents what the Space Wolves are about. And the fact that, the other close combat guys he was with had to catch up with him because his battle lust and his frenzy to get to the front line was so great that, he just tossed aside all thought for his own personal safety just for to get into the thick of it. But then of course you're right, the rest of my troops moved up and there was like supporting fire.
I think you lost 1 Marine to shooting.
Yeah. So it was, I think you were unlucky with your spells early in the game. But what really lost you the game was the initiative rolls.
Spoilers.
But even for the first few turns, like,
so I did lose initiative both times, but so what was interesting was, you did lose one guy that first turn, and that was because of a fucking downtown shot from my Marine with the Legion Vexilia. So if you, Marines have 2 health and bolt guns do 1 damage by default.
Yeah.
But any weapon that gets a score of 6 or higher, which is obviously easier if you're rolling a D8 or a D10, has the potential to do double damage. And therefore kill a Marine in 1 shot, and I managed to get a natural 6 with a bolt gun shot and just kill a Marine on the other side of the board, which was nice. That was my only upshot in the first turn.
Yeah.
But yeah, the second turn, I hit a problem, which is that I couldn't resurrect anyone that had died because my entire kind of like little command group got wiped out. So I was down to, it was the skeletons don't come back if 4 of them die at once issue that has haunted me twice this month.
Laughing at earlier, but actually it does exist in this
game. Which is, because I had no unit I could cast things with and add things to. I think this is one of my big mistakes is I kept my guys as powerful feeling blocks of 4, whereas there's no reason you can't just occupy, you could occupy 4 different squares with one group of 4 people, obviously.
Yeah.
And that is still blocking those squares to the enemy. They're just a lot less powerful in combat. But also then only one of them has to fight in combat. The others get to shoot.
Absolutely.
Which is, again, a really interesting strategic thing. This idea to keep everyone in these like chunky blocks really hurt me because also spells are cast by those blocks. And so if I only had 2 blocks, as I did at the start of the second turn, because I succeeded in wiping out 1 block, I only got 2 spell casts and neither of them could be resurrect. So I went for one of them, which was to get a free attack. I succeeded, but the attack didn't do any damage. And then the other group cast Chain Lightning, which I think did hurt Gygor, actually. But not a lot. But, because he'd lost all of his wounds from the previous turn, it wasn't enough to kind of slow his kind of merciless advance. Yeah. So the second turn was kind of an interesting, you repositioned quite a lot in order to get ready to, because bear in mind, like, your victory condition is get any unit off the board. So your repositioning was basically to just move everything into position to crush the one unit standing in front of you in one exit.
Yes. Yeah, the poor Space Marines, the poor Thousand Suns at least, I think there were 4 of them, but they were facing, like, Gygor, a Sister of Silence, Space Marine, Captain with, Thunderhammer. They just lined up right opposite them. And then the other guys basically just moved up, so they were out of sight of the Terminator squad that was flanking, but still able to shoot the poor remaining doorkeepers. Yeah. So it was about executing those people. And then I moved up my third block of 4 up as a kind of blocking squad, basically, to put them into the middle of the board to stop the Terminators from getting into close combat at all with the rest of them.
What was really interesting is, so that first melee attack, because the person with initiative, which was you both first times, which is one of those things that went a bit south for me, but gets to pick the first unit to engage in combat, but after that you take it in turns, and you engage with your melee units. And I think you got 3 crits, which is how you ended up killing 3 of them in one go, because there were 4 Marines there and you killed 3 of them immediately.
It's because, so Gygor is on like a D12 or something attacking, and he gets to attack twice. Which I probably forgot to do, but oh well. And the Sister Superior is on like a D8 or something. Yeah. Sword. So they're all on more than D6.
It's a statistically likely crit, basically.
Yeah. So like when people say crit, normally it means, oh, you got really lucky there. But actually, with the dice, when the dice are big and you stack them in that way, then you're getting those crits.
But I've discovered that D10s can still roll 2s.
They really can. They really can.
1 in 10, turns out. on a D10, it's only 40% likely that you're going to do it, right? Like, that's still...
Yeah, that's where it's going to be really interesting to kind of get used to that maths. Or the kind of, not maths really, but the way luck works in that game. Like a miss could be unlikely. It's more, almost like the crit chance is as important as hitting in some ways. Especially because, a Space Marine has 2 health. Yeah. And that crit gets rid of a whole body. So it's those crits that are really essential to wiping out a squad.
Yeah,
so it's just
definitely
really
an interesting thing.
Yeah.
That attack left 1 Marine with a heavy bolter who could fire back, but facing everything. So, he didn't survive, and obviously I was struggling to bring up my other squad to basically stop you. I didn't have a choice about having a squad off to the side because of the number of deployment zones and how many men I had.
Yeah.
But the question is, like, how quickly could I have brought them around?
Redeployed into multiple squares.
Yeah. Or use one of the spells to get them in faster, which I could have done once I knew you weren't interested in a particular direction. So yeah, there's definitely interesting decisions I could have made. But one thing I realized was that based on the move I'd done that turn, so after you killed that squad, Gygor, the Sister of Silence, and Sergeant with the Thunderhammer were in front of the exit. And you can move 2 squares in a turn, which means that you were, if we were being cynical, we could have called it there. Because it's like, as long as you get to the movement phase, you are out. You're done.
Yeah.
Right? You've won. But then I realized that the Terminator unit that had survived was 5 squares away from the exit square, and that's the range you need to cast Firewall. So I realized if I can cast Firewall, I can block that exit. And if I can cast it every turn, I can block that exit forever. Hypothetically.
Yes.
If I can win the top trumps. And on the next turn, I did win the top trumps for the Firewall, which succeeded in blocking you. And then I won the initiative, which is very crucial. Because it allowed me to move my Terminator Sergeant up and block you with him, and then engage at range with the remaining surviving Marines behind him.
Yeah.
And I think on that turn, I managed to take your blocking unit down to 2 Marines, like kill another couple. And obviously your soldiers at this point were blocking themselves. So you couldn't rearrange them very much. Which is kind of an interesting thing that, like, I'd pinned you against yourself because you had that wedge constructed.
Yeah.
There was no way for you to get Gygor in, for example, because the Marines were all crammed together. And also, most of them didn't have line of sight because you were stuck around corners and things. So that's kind of, an interesting strategic thing that, like, even though I was massively outnumbered, I could hold up a much bigger formation just by hitting it in the right place.
Yeah.
I mean, admittedly, it was the only place I could hit it, so it wasn't like strategic genius or anything. It was just, it gummed up your works, like pinning you on both sides. One side with magic fire and the other side with a big shiny red man.
That's how Thousand Suns do.
Indeed. And I had this thought then that, like, I can still do this because I can resurrect people. And now that I've split the group up a bit, I can resurrect people into those units. It's only one model a turn, but everything hinges on me keeping the firewall up. Technically. And so, turn after that, you failed to kill the Terminator, which demonstrated, like, you poured a lot of fire into that Terminator and he just didn't die, because...
Yeah, which is why I didn't line up against him in the first place.
Yeah.
That's why I stacked the odds
I think
against
if we
him.
were to play that scenario again, I would put the Terminator closer to you at the start, in a
Yeah.
kind of like, hey...
Very hard to deal with that Terminator. I mean, he's only got 2 health, but his armor, he's rolling a
D10. Yeah.
Makes a huge difference.
Yeah, totally. So in the turn after that, I went for the firewall again, because if I can get the firewall again, then you still have to deal with me, and you can't go out through the other door because I'm blocking it. And that was a really close one. That was like 5-6 or something.
Yeah, it was close.
But I failed. So the firewall didn't go off. But then I realized that but I think one of the cards you chose was like, if you treat this as its higher value and you block the spell, I get an extra spell. So it's like you can gamble on, which is again a really interesting decision. You can gamble on giving me an extra spell as long as, you take it for that thing, which is probably worth it, because blocking me from stopping you getting out is one of the most important things to do.
Yeah.
But, with the extra spell cast, I was able to, resurrect my, Tactical Marine Sergeant into the Terminator unit. Because as you said at the time, there's definitely nothing suspicious or chaosy about that. He just came back to life. It's fine. Totally above board.
He was sleeping.
Yeah. He was very sleepy from bullets. But he's fine now. And then, to cast the spell that give them an extra attack. Like, technically, I don't know I think that is doable, because I think the only limitation is you can't cast the same spell twice, not that you can't cast it the same unit twice, which might have been a mistake that I made earlier when I didn't cast the third time. But yeah, so I gave them an instant attack, and the thought was, the Terminator Captain and the Sergeant both have power swords. If they can both get crits on D8s and kill the 2 Marines in front of them, then there's a rule called press the attack, which means that if you wipe out an enemy in melee combat, you immediately move into the space they occupied. If I immediately move into the space they occupied, you can't move, because I'm pinning both of your other units by being there, which again stops you from getting off the board, even though the firewall has failed. So I had this narrow chance of, like, I have to get 2 crits, because I have to do enough damage to kill 2 Marines. But it was the sort of the tantalizing thing of, like, I can just still stop you if everything goes perfectly. But then I rolled 2 3s.
Yeah.
And you saved both of them.
Yeah.
So
They were fine.
Yeah, they were fine. And nothing happened. And at that point, during the movement phase, there was nothing stopping Guy Gore from just running happily into Tizca to murder more innocent people.
I do like the idea that the fire exit caught fire. Sorry. That's magic.
I think I said at the time, like, well, let's call the burning of Prospero.
Well, if it hadn't burned anything yet, then it would have been a failure.
But it was a really interesting ending, because, like, even though it felt like it was over because I got crushed quickly, and admittedly this is like the fastest battle report we've done on this pod, there were so many little moments towards the end that felt like it could have turned, that I'm excited to see how those other scenarios resolve.
And also a completely different game if you'd have had a initiative roll earlier on. Like, be able to position and block me a little bit more effectively would have changed how that entire scenario played out. Yeah. It's very replayable, sure. I think. Like, you could replay it, but first of all, knowing how the rules work and stuff, but also with a different spell lore, and just your ability to organically redeploy units into different squads as you move across the board is just really interesting.
Yeah, I'm excited to try it again, actually.
Yeah.
Like, that's still the kind of canon outcome. And as you said at the time, it makes sense that, I mean, quote unquote, historically, the Space Wolves win in Prospero, right? Like, it's called the burning of Prospero, not like the mostly burning of Prospero, some unburned.
Yeah, I felt like the scenario's definitely weighted against the Tzeentchian forces. Though they're not Tzeentchian fully yet.
Not yet.
Against
not
the
yet.
Thousand Suns.
Not until Magnus says, I really need a way off this planet.
Hey Tzeentch, how about it? So I felt like it was deliberately wasted a bit against 1,000 Suns, and it would have been embarrassing if the Space Wolves had failed to get through the door to the entire campaign. And that Guy Gold kind of bust through is kind of cool as well. Like, I'm starting to like him just for his rules as much as anything else.
Yeah, he's kind of coming alive. Like, I'm now excited to have Ahriman kind of come and
Yeah,
shut him
I
the
think
hell
the
down.
magic, I think surely he's going to have a load of magic buffs and stuff that are going to make your magic. more
Ahriman
potent.
gets a bonus. I think you draw an extra card if Ahriman is in that unit. Like, you just draw again, and there's nothing you can do about it.
That's
like,
nice. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, he does. And there's one of the cards that reacts specifically to Ahriman being there. So, like, yeah, it's exciting because he's on his way. And, you know, I think the next scenario we're going to play is all Sisters of Silence versus Ahriman and Terminators. So it's much smaller units, like smaller model count.
Oh, is it just Sisters of Silence?
It's just Sisters
Oh,
versus
cool.
Ahriman and Terminators. And it's the one, like, so the way it works is there's 6 scenarios, and the first and the final one, I haven't looked up what the final one is, apart from the fact that it's called Will of the Primarchs, and I think it takes place as Leman Russ and Magnus are fighting,
man, that's
which is
awesome.
fucking rad.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Like, I just got the kind of nerd goosebumps from just saying that, really.
Forge World models.
Yeah, and sit them off to the side of the table.
Yeah. They've just announced the
Forge World Magnus.
Forge World Magnus, which looks fantastic.
Yeah,
and it's
yeah.
on sale at Warhammerfest.
Yeah, what a fabulous red man he is.
Beautiful red man.
They're all gorgeous, as we established. All the Primarchs are fucking smoking hot.
Yeah.
The Emperor's good boys. And bad boys as well,
Oh, yeah.
to be fair.
The bad boys are even better.
10 out of 20 of them are bad boys. But yeah, so the first and the last one are kind of set in sequence, but the other 4 are relatively fluid.
Yeah.
So the next one, we're doing them based on which models we've finished, but the next one I think is supposed to be like the psychic battle of wills between Magnus and his inner circle versus the Sisters of Silence, Ahriman and the Sisters of Silence who are being sent explicitly to shut that shit the hell down.
Yeah, interesting. I built all my Sisters of Silence as purely close combat, which may have been foolish because I like the look of the swords. So we'll see how that pans out in that scenario.
I thought about doing my Terminators in a more like one, because you can build them with dual lightning claws or a mixture of weapons, and I decided I just wanted a bit of everything.
Yeah, it's good.
So like
That's good.
one of them's got like a Reaper autocannon, which is the biggest gun in the world.
Yeah, it looks amazing.
So,
Yeah, my original plan was to try and field the Sisters of Silence in gold armor in AOS as a kind of auxiliary Stormcast force or something I could put into my Stormcast army in some way. But they're so small and the proportions are so different from 30k to AOS that it just looks stupid.
yeah, they are tiny.
They are, yeah. So yeah, that's what they've all got swords now.
I actually thought about using a Sister of Silence as a Fate Master for a Tzeentch army with Tzeentch bits, basically.
Oh yeah.
So I like the idea of trying to find a way of putting a female character into a Tzeentch army. Like, I've decided that my Sangor Shaman is female, but it's because it's impossible to tell, because it's a bird person. And, you know, mutants are easy to, you know, decide one way or the other. But I like the idea of having like a kind of gold armored figure on a disc of Tzeentch with a glaive.
Oh,
It's
yeah, I
like a
can see
kind
that.
of,
Yeah.
but they're just so small. Like, I may end up using the 40k Ahriman model as a Fate Master for AOS with conversions, obviously.
Yeah, that could work, yeah.
Because it kind of looks right. Like the Fate Master model as it is super old. But yeah, also it's just a way of getting Ahriman everywhere. Love Ahriman.
Has he got does he point as in the 40k?
He has, it's a really, so, 30k Ahriman is pointing.
Yeah.
40k Ahriman has a staff in one hand, and his other hand is like, it's actually in a sort of like a crook, like a kind of, actually it's exactly handily, it's exactly how you'd be holding a shield. It's exactly that kind of elbow shape, but he's got it open. It's like trailing warp flame,
Right.
which is a really cool look. What I would probably do, because the Fate Master should have burning weapons, is replace the staff with a glaive, probably from the Zangor kit. Or just the head of the staff with a blade, so it becomes a glaive.
Yeah.
And maybe do some green stuff fire for that. And then put one of the spare Zangor shields over the warp flame and then build the warp flame around it.
No, that's cool. Yeah.
Like, that might work quite well.
Yeah,
Because also, I mean, he's wearing such heavy robes that you can't really see the Space Marine armor. I'd need to do something to replace his backpack, because the Space Marine backpack is the thing that really gives him away, but it could look pretty good. I don't know. I haven't practiced in doing a Fate Master for that army for a while, so that's a future thing. Also, by that point, I may have decided that new 40k is out and I want to do Thousand Suns, so I'll just do Ahriman as Ahriman. But, my boy, the sad librarian.
He's awesome. Poor sad librarian.
Yeah, everything goes badly for him.
It does. Their story's so good. I'm very impressed with the Prospero set.
Yeah, me too.
Both the models and the game. And yeah, surprisingly the game actually. So we'll probably have more battle reports.
Yeah, it feels like the kind of thing where it'd be fun to play that couple of battles back to back. Like, we played that first scenario and it was just like, okay, yeah, next. But yeah, I'm definitely impressed by it. I think it'd be a good entry point to the, well, we might get to this with questions, which brings us on to the next section of the pod, but it feels like, yeah, they're doing a good job furnishing you with different ways into this fiction, and that is a full game for 2 people. It doesn't have the flexibility of the war game in that you can't just expand it out forever and keep adding new things, but it's still, like an accessible way into that universe that practically comes with terrain because you're playing on these cardboard bases, that kind of thing.
It's a really high quality set that reminds me of the Space Hulk re-release they did, where all of the like board pieces for the Space Hulk re-release are laminated, embossed, just as good quality cardboard board pieces as you could hope for, really, with great art. This is no different.
Yeah, the art looks great. There'll be photos in the blog post which accompany it, but those models looked good fighting on that piece of cardboard.
They did.
The burning of cardboard continues next month, maybe. Should we do some questions from Miniatures questions?
Yeah, let's do it.
You got a few this week. Peter Fienio did write in to ask us, would we play new Warhammer 40k, and if so, which armies would we play? But the answer to that is very much answered, and is obviously yes, but I wanted to give him a brief shoot-out, because obviously he took the time to write in to ask us something that it turned out was going to be extremely relevant.
Yeah, for sure.
And I don't think he should be...
did he know something we didn't?
I don't think he should be punished simply for...
Is he a Zinchian wizard?
Yeah, for asking the most relevant question around. Nonetheless. All right. So the first question comes from Isaac, who has a bone to pick with me.
Oh no.
Specifically. And I might hold my own with this. We'll find out. Isaac writes, "You keep using that word. I don't think it means what you think it means." Quoting The Princess Bride. "In the last podcast, Chris described the swirly magical vortex thing that the Celestant Prime stands on as an orrery. I believe he's also used the word orrery in this sense a couple of other times on Crate and Crowbar. So I have written to offer a clarification. An orrery is a mechanical model of the solar system named after the 4th Earl of Orrery, for whom the first modern orrery was created. It has literally no other meaning. For future reference, here is the one Warhammer model which could be accurately described as containing an orrery," and he links to the Celestial Hurricanum, which is an old Empire magic chariot cannon thing. I probably used chariot incorrectly there. It's probably technically...
There aren't any horses on
it's probably technically a carriage, and I apologize to carriage specific.
Have you made an errory?
Oh, I might wrap this one up right here. Anyway, Isaac continues, "Please stop using it in any other context. I'm aware this is the most pedantic of points to make, but it grates so much every time Chris does this. In all other respects, the new podcast is very good."
In all other respects.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
And then he does have a question, but I just wanted to respond to this by saying, I get where you're coming from. I understand that, in this case, the word does have a specific technical meaning that, has a bearing on its, technically correct use. However, a fun thing about language is words can often be used to describe something by alluding to something that they're a bit like, is in this specific way. I'm going to be pedantic now, as someone who's sort of into language. It's in this way that language gains its fluidity. And so if you say that somebody is standing on an orrery and they're not literally standing on a model of the solar system, but saying that gives the listener or reader or whoever a semi-accurate, imaginative sense of the thing you're getting at, then that use of language has been successful regardless of whether or not you're technically correct. 'Cause the purpose of language is to communicate information, not to adhere to a set kind of schema of technical accuracy. However, on behalf of any orrery enthusiast that was badly thrown off by my incorrect technical use of the term, then I do apologize.
I am imagining the Prime standing on an historical orrery now, and it's a very silly image in my.
It is a silly image. I mean, admittedly, that
could happen in
AOS. That is a fair point. That if the mental image that was conjured was of someone stood on a model of the solar system, then yeah, I appreciate that's not accurate. If however obviously the intent only matters to a certain extent, but the intent was to conjure the image of someone standing on a swirling model of space, which is kind of what it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, admittedly, I would say that from a purely linguistic point of view, trying to ground the definition of a word purely in its historical context is extremely flimsy. If we were going to get technical about it, you probably couldn't, that wouldn't fly. It would rotate around in a circle forever, much like an orrery.
I think we had described what that thing was also in the podcast. Like we'd said it was a swirly space vortex, I think.
Yeah.
Something like that.
I mean, it sounds like
then
Isaac
just
is specifically sensitive about the misuse of the word orrery, which I get.
I find it quite endearing. I like that.
Yeah, I mean, people have their linguistic bugbears and there's nothing wrong with that, except linguistically that's incorrect. So,
What's his question?
his question is, is Tom's current victory streak a product of better luck, his superior tactical ability, or is the AOS meta balanced in favor of the Stormcast or Space Marine style lower model count elite armies in general? How do you both feel about the meta more generally? Games Workshop is pretty notorious for being incapable of creating a balanced metagame. Balanced metagame, I mean, not balanced metagame. And having never actually played AOS, I was wondering if this trend is carried over to the new system. Yours, Isaac.
I would say that the matchup of our current forces is heavily balanced in my favour because Chris hasn't built a lot of the new stuff that comes with the Tzeentch book that would make his army really formidable. So Chris has got some Skyfires and some Zangor, and they synergize really, really well with the new rule set. And without a lot of that stuff, Chris is just lacking some fundamental ways to stop me.
I'm extremely glass cannony at the moment.
Yeah.
And it's that thing of you have specifically an army that is very good at shrugging off big hits,
yeah,
which is what I do.
And it's interesting because like I win all the time against Chris and I lose all the time against my friend Chimp who has a Flesh Eater Courts army because my army is very bad at dealing with horde armies and also I kind of suck. So it's definitely not generalmanship because when I'm against like a more competitive matchup I'm quite bad. But there's definitely a kind of inequality in build structure at the moment between our armies, which is why we've gone to play Prospero for a bit while we both kind of change our armies and build new things and then reconvene with new forces that hopefully might redress the balance a little bit. But those games like have all been fun, irrespective.
Yeah, they've all been fun. They've all been narratively rewarding.
Yeah, for sure.
Like I think, yeah, in terms of the metagame more generally, AOS is an interesting case because obviously if you play Tournament Age of Sigmar, which I'm not interested in, there are things that are very good. There's definitely tiers. I don't necessarily think that hits the ideals of balance where anything can work. Particularly because the rule set is so big and so broad and so loose. Like 40k, I think maybe this is a problem not necessarily with Games Workshop specifically as a company, but the type of game they make, where there are a bajillion units and a bajillion different interlocking rules and spells and things, and all those things are there to reward people for collecting more and building an army that suits them. On a cynical level, it rewards people for having more stuff. On a positive level, it rewards people for customizing their stuff, which is after all what it's about. That's where the satisfaction comes from. The problem with that is it's so open that cheese is just going to be there somewhere. Stuff's going to be weird. We were talking about this before we recorded, but actually my army is very competitively viable if I decided to build it and play it in a certain way.
Yeah. Because
of a mad, obviously unintentional cheese thing that you can do with a powerful Tzeentch unit called a Skyfire, which is a Zangor Beastman archer standing on a disc of Tzeentch. And they can fly around, they can shoot things. Shooting is very powerful in AOS. They have a 16-inch flying move. So they can get anywhere they want. They can shoot people, they can kite units, that kind of thing. Which is fine. That's not necessarily overpowered in and of itself, but one of the things about this, which is weird, is a little quirk of the way those keywords that we mentioned earlier are written is that any unit that has a disc of Tzeentch gets the demon keyword. Because the disc itself is a demon. Doesn't matter who's standing on the disc, they get the demon keyword. But unfortunately, this means that units that probably shouldn't get to interact with some of the demon-specific spells. So there is a spell called Fold Reality that is intended, obviously, for bringing demons back to life. And when you say demons in the context of a Tzeentch army, you were talking about pink horrors, flamers, screamers, maybe chariots. But they're rarely run in a unit. And things like flamers are upcosted points-wise enough that the ability to summon them back with a spell is potentially very powerful. It's kind of obvious that no one playtested the scenario where someone's using Fold Reality to bring Skyfires back to life on the basis that the disc, not the rider, has the demon keyword, which is the kind of thing that creeps in when the game is this broad.
Yeah, every single unit has its own war scroll, which is basically a page of rules
Yeah.
full of specific rules to them. And a lot of them are keyword activated. And there are probably like 1,000 of them now. Well, hundreds, certainly hundreds. And when you have that going on, like you could have an enormous team of people combing through all of this. And they're not going to find the outlying kind of, quirks that make truly competitive lists sing. They're just not going to find it. The crowd finds that. So, when it's suddenly released to the public and, thousands of people are playing it, they will find it because they have the resource to do it. But the actual producer of the game doesn't. And that's just an offshoot of the fact of that form of rules making. Like if you get every time you draw up a new war scroll, it's interacting with an increasingly vast combination of ever growing rule sets and you can't balance that.
In GW's defense, the system works fine if you concentrate on building and playing with the units you think are interesting and that you want to collect, and you and your friends agree not to be a dick when interpreting the rules. So, if you and I were playing that, I would probably just house rules it that Skyfires don't count as demons for the purpose of that particular rule, because it doesn't make sense narratively, and we're all about that, the feel of the game and the sense of the game. Like, it makes sense to me based on the description of the spell that reality folds in on itself and more demons emerge. It doesn't make sense that more Skyfires emerge, because they are a different part of the fiction. They emerge from something else. They come from something other part of the story that we're telling. The problem is at tournaments where it's all about winning, and that's when these kind of exceptions come into play. And it's why I think, I find games like X-Wing much more gratifying, because the rules are much more transparent for this reason. So to answer the question, I guess, it's not a perfectly balanced metagame, but also that hasn't affected us at all, really.
Yeah.
Like, nothing about the meta has been ever really had any bearing on the games we've played. That's just me sucking.
I would say that I've watched loads of the brilliant Warhammer community Twitch stuff, where every week they play games of AOS and games of Warhammer 40,000, and they are doing a really good job of covering tournaments. And this very weekend, actually, we're recording this, they're covering the South Coast GT, which is the biggest AOS tournament in the world. And whereas the meta does have these extremes and these quirks, the range of armies that are competitive is considerable for Age of Sigmar at the moment.
Yeah, that's true as well.
Whereas, the perfect ideal is that anything could be competitive if you play it very well. Obviously, nothing can achieve that. But the way the place AOS is at the moment, like, you're seeing even Death armies doing well, and there's not been a properly major Death release since Flesh Eater Courts. And you're seeing lots of, obviously thanks to the Skyfires that exploit, the Tzeentch is well represented, but you're still seeing loads of Stormcast, and you're still seeing loads of Sylvaneth, which that book was released more than a year ago now, I think. So, and lots of destruction kind of ogre forces. So, the actual range of stuff that is competitive, even at the highest level, I think is impressive for AOS. Maybe that's just because it hasn't been around a huge amount of time. And maybe as, we get into more and more releases 2 years down the line, then certain things will just emerge as superior. But at the same time, Games Workshop patch the game now. Like, they release updated war scrolls, and they see that happening. They're actually equipped in this game to be able to say, "Oh no, we're not. That's not as intended. We're going to update these rules. We're going to re-release the war scroll," and maybe that bodes very well for the health of the game in the long term.
Yeah, I agree. I think the app is a good move in this regard, because it means that if they ever implemented the rule that, like, an official tournament, or to be recognized as an official AOS tournament, you have to use the app versions of the war scrolls, so there's no going back to previous battle tomes to find the particular things. And that gives them a lot of freedom to tweak this in a way that they haven't had before, because the situation with 40k for a long time has been that you can show up, you can source your army from 7 different books to combine the rules that are favorable to you, and that's where these like you're saying, that's where these real balance issues come in. It's not someone wrote a bad rule. Vast majority of the time, it's
an unexpected interaction with a different rule. Yeah.
From 7 years ago or something mad, where it's like, okay, now this is broken. And that's, I think it's not the players bear responsibility, because ultimately the makers and the designers of the game bear responsibility for creating something where balance is possible most of the time. But, you know, just as sort of narrative-minded players who are having fun with their mates can pull the game towards fairness, so too can competitive-minded players pull the game towards imbalance, because that urge to exploit rules does not necessarily occur outside of a strictly competitive context, right? Except for maybe, unless you are, you know, unless you're dispositionally inclined to try and break games. You know, most people will just play them as they see them until they hit one of these weird moments.
I think that's the competitive game mindset, is that how can I break this? Or how can I find something a bit disgusting that's going to just do absurd amounts? Like, it's a puzzle. Like, it's a form of puzzle solving. Yeah. Obviously, then you still have to execute on the tabletop, but there's no doubt that, you know, some of these destruction forces are just incredible at just getting across the board straight away the first turn and dealing vast amounts of mortal wounds. And, you know, a lot of forces just aren't going to stand up to that.
No.
And if you're having to build your army against that, which obviously that's how the meta starts, then, you know, that's one way of playing the game. And I still think there are lots of competitive ways of doing it, lots of competitive armies. But I worry that the patching, idea of this type of game is that it's very difficult for your average player to keep up with patches and facts. Yeah. And that I wish that, AOS had a more elegant way of communicating when things had changed. So I'm sitting here with my Stormcast book, and that might be different in 6 months. I might have tweaked the way a Castellan works or something like that. And there's no I don't know where to go to get that stuff. I know that they publish game facts in the apps, but I don't want to have to trawl through like loads of text with highlighted pink bits to find out what's actually changed in my army. I kind of want, I don't know how to solve this, but I almost want bulletins almost to tell me how my shit has changed.
It should be like you tell the app what you own, and then it gives you a little pop-up to say like, hey,
this has changed.
You nerfed him.
Yeah, this is, and the alteration is available for
this. But I think also, like, you know, the goal is not to be a world championship player. It's to collect and play with the stuff you're interested in. And that's a different set of objectives. Like, I was thinking about this, like, for a while we were considering, like, do we, you know, try and get to the point where we have semi-competitive armies to go and do the Warhammer Fest tournament, which I think we've sort of set against now, really. It's a bit too much Warhammer.
As of today. Yeah, we should talk about why we decided not to do that, actually. I think that's quite interesting.
Yeah.
Because I think that would be interesting to people who are thinking about going to tournaments.
Sure. So, I mean, the point I was going to say is that, I was staring down the barrel of like trying to get through all my Zangors in a month just to have stuff ready for a tournament. And I was like, well, if I want to be competitive, I have 2 boxes of Enlightened, and Enlightened are the kit that can be either the melee focused Zangor Enlightened or the Zangor Skyfires. And I had always planned to do 1 box of Enlightened and 1 box of Skyfires. And I still do, but I had that moment of knowing that like, oh man, if I really wanted to win tournaments, I would just make both boxes of Skyfires. And then I realized like, partly, I mean, 1, I'm not very good at this game. I've won 1 game ever. 2, it's a bit of a dice game. I know I play a lot of X-Wing. I play a lot of X-Wing at tournaments to a reasonably high level. I know that sometimes you can get diced out of a tournament. It's all about odds. It's all about odds over the course of a long day sometimes. And in a game of X-Wing, where you are just there for the day and you're composing a squadron out of stuff you own out of a bigger collection, and that squadron dissolves back into your collection as rapidly as it emerges from it, that randomness is easy to accept. If you go all in on trying super hard an AOS tournament to the point that you are doing things with your expensive models that you don't really want to do to have a better shot at winning, and then you lose, that's going to fucking suck. So just do what you want to do. Like, if I go to an AOS tournament now, I'm going to go with the army I want to take. And if it is not 100% competitively viable, fine. I'll play it to the best of my ability and I'll have fun. But the hobby investment, all of that stuff that surrounds it, makes it absolutely not worth trying to metagame it too much. Because unless the metagame aligns perfectly with what I want from a hobby point of view, from a painting, from a look, feel point of view, it's not worth it.
And the metagame can turn on a dime with a book or with a FAQ release. And all that expensive time and money you put into a particular competitive build will suddenly not be worth anything anymore. And, you know, you have to be aware of that.
Yeah, suddenly they nerf
That's how it's
Skyfires and Enlightened are amazing.
Yeah.
And I didn't build my Enlightened. Like, yeah.
What are you going to do? Yeah, and there are a few reasons why. So I was very tempted to go and do the tournament at Warhammer Fest, and a few things put me off. First of all was what Chris just described. Secondly, there are 4 games in one day, and a game lasts 2 hours, and like 8 hours over a course of like a 10-hour period or 10 or 12-hour period of Warhammer is a lot of probably quite eventually stressful, and tiring. It would feel like a chore by probably the halfway point. So having like 4 games in one day is just not appealing to me. I'm not going to spend a lot of money to go to Coventry to go and do that, really.
Yeah.
The other thing is, like, I've not played in a tournament like this before, and I've no idea what the etiquette is in terms of how things are measured, like the actual kind of XYZ of what's going to piss people off if I behave in a certain way. Obviously I know how to be like a, polite human being and stuff, but I'm talking about actually how things are moved around, what I need to tell my opponent at any given point, like how I should be describing my actions, how dice are rolled, and to what extent do I need to explain every war score to my opponent, all of these kind of tiny little things that make up etiquette in a competitive game context. I just have no kind of grounding in AOS for that whatsoever. The idea of just kind of wading into that, spending loads of money to wade into that and potentially just like annoy a load of people and have a bad experience is a significant worry.
There's, there are tournaments coming up in Bristol that probably be a better introduction to that stuff.
I think so.
That's the sort of thing I'm a little bit more comfortable now, because like I think a couple of years now, which is a weird thought, of Tournament X-Wing have taught me how to talk to people as strangers in that context, which is, I think is a really valuable skill. Something I find very valuable about tabletop gaming is, my background in competitive computer gaming, there's no concept of etiquette. There's no concept that you even have to treat the other person like a human being.
Right.
That is necessary even to the people who fail at it in tabletop gaming, or people who do struggle with an attitude problem and that kind of thing. And it's a valuable thing to know how to do. I found that as long as you don't ever present yourself as patronizing, there's no issue over explaining things. So that's the balance to strike. That to make it clear through your tone that you're explaining things in the aim of you having a fun game, not in the aim of teaching your opponent how to play. So, the thing I've always found is like saying, here's my list, or here's my army, here's my squadron. Is there anything you'd like me to explain? Because most people will go, I'm used to this from an X-Wing background, but it's true. It was true in AOS as well. Like, I'm not sure what his deal is, or I'm not sure what this unit does. And then you just go, okay, well, I'll do this, this, and this. And you don't read them the rules. You just say, all right, they're really good at this, this, and this, and there's this special rule. And I think if you're super honest, and I think this is a good measure of who you are as a competitive player, you should be willing to explain the strategic environment in which that unit has an advantage. So you'll say like, oh, well, this guy, I'm trying to think of an Age of Sigmar example, but it's pretty easy to go to the next one. But it's like, oh, you see, well, this unit will get a free shot if you move in range of him during the activation phase. So really, he's like a small blocker. He wants to get in your way, that kind of thing. Because if you're confident in your ability to execute a strategy, you should be able to explain the top level version of what that strategy is. The kinds of things they would know if they had just played more of the game.
But maybe like a super competitive person who's more of a dick would be like, oh, I'll explain the bare bones, and it's up to you to figure out.
Yeah, it's up to you to figure out where the line is.
Yeah.
I think, like, I've legitimately lost competitive games of X-Wing because I've told my opponent, oh, you have a reroll, which they would have forgotten. Whereas in Tournament X-Wing, if you forget, you forget. Like, you didn't do it, you didn't do it. Like, you don't get to ask for it a turn later, that kind of thing. But, I have that urge of like, I hate seeing people get disappointed. So I always go like, oh, don't forget, like. Yeah,
there's and a lot of AOS tournaments have sportsmanship scores and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Which kind of.
Yeah, that's the word for it. Sportsmanship is a real thing. Like, like for me, I know from this experience of doing this over the time that like, nothing upsets me more than poor sportsmanship when someone displays it. It really ruins my mood. It really sours my feel of an event if someone is genuinely a dick. It's very rare in tabletop, but it does happen. And I know that I never react hostile to it in the time, but I become very sad.
Yeah.
Like, I walk away from games upset, even if I didn't say anything to my opponent, just because I've had to kind of like ignore them and focus on my own game because they're being bad. And sportsmanship is very important to me, so I try to be super pleasant to play with, even if I'm having a bad game or even if I'm having a bad time, honestly. Everyone fucks that up, but like that's probably more important to me than winning, because, you know, I've had games of X-Wing where I've walked away from it feeling like I've been ungracious as a loser or ungracious as a winner even. Thankfully not very many, but when it happens, the feeling of like, I fucked that up is worse than, it overrules the feeling of having won, if you won, right?
Yeah.
So, like, sportsmanship absolutely comes first to me, so I'm kind of comfortable in that regard. Like, I'm comfortable that I could go and play 4 games of AOS in a day. It's just whether or not I would still be having fun was the end of it is the thing. Like,
that is the main problem.
And therefore, if I'm not having fun anymore, the task of maintaining that, I don't want my lack of fun to ruin the day of someone else I'm playing against who maybe is having fun. So like, the fact that I have to keep up that appearance and be like fun to play with, which is important to me, like that is the pressure that I'd rather avoid. I think.
For sure. Especially with like the expense and the travel to go and do it. It's like, you're right. Like if it was a Bristol thing where I could just go down the road, catch a train, play for a day and get into it, then that's a really good way to trial it. But then a big, huge hobby project that then ends in potential disappointment and, you know, uncertainty, not so good.
Yeah, I think I'd like more of a run. I'd love to do one of those big events someday, particularly when there's like the painting element of it and you can make a display board for your models, that kind of thing. That really appeals to me, but that's further off.
Yeah, I really like the idea as well. Like South Coast GT is very good at this, and Adepticon has this element as well, where it's also just a giant celebration of beautiful painting and model construction and army construction. That there's a huge element, you know, there's a huge celebration of the hobby side of things, where people spend a year like planning this army and painting it and making it beautiful. Then you might get to play against that army on a beautiful table, and that's really, really cool.
Yeah. Something that I think we were talking about this earlier, and I mentioned that worth mentioning is something I think the X-Wing scene does really well that Warhammer could potentially learn from is, so I've done big X-Wing events. Like, I remember I didn't manage to go this year, but the Yavin Open, which is basically the UK national for a particular international track. Last year, the first time they ran it in Birmingham, it was the most intense weekend of X-Wing of my life, because they hosted a regional tournament on the Friday, and then the sort of national open took place over the next 2 days. And the regional was a 5-round Swiss, so 5 rounds of X-Wing, and a round of X-Wing is 75 minutes, so it's not short. It's not as long as a full game of Age of Sigmar, but it's, you know, you're still playing 5 75-minute games. I think it was 5, and then more if you made the cut for the final top 16, which I didn't. And then the first round of the national was 6 rounds in a day, so 6 75-minute rounds. And then if you made the final day, there was an additional 3 rounds. And I did make the final day. Yeah. So, because I went 4 and 2 on the first day and then made the second day and then bombed out on the second day a little bit. But, the thing they did that was really good is because of the way Swiss pairings work or Swiss rankings work, there can be a point in Swiss where if you lose your first 3 games, you're out. Like, mathematically, there is no way. Hypothetically, you could make the second day, but even if you did, it's extremely unlikely that you would eventually make the cut. And it's extremely likely to even make the second day. So, what this happens, and this is a tournament with hundreds of people, you know, upwards of 400 players, like, if you don't make it through that first day, hypothetically, you could have paid for a 2-day tournament, but you're kind of done by halfway through the first one just on performance. And so what they do is they tend to arrange side events for the second day where there are basically like silly formats and just for fun tournaments. Like, we're going to do a tournament where everyone gets one ship and we all play on one massive board with like 8 people and we see what happens. And there are extra prizes available for that, and there's fun things to do on the second day. And that would be a format for AOS I'd be really interested in.
Yeah, that's really
where
good.
It's like a weekend that you book and you go and do the weekend. But if after the first day, you know, because what a lot of people do is when they know, because a 6-game day is punishing. And what they know is that if you do, you know, what a lot of people know that by game 4, they know by middle afternoon, I can't make it anymore. So they drop. And they go and have the rest of the nice time at the games event or whatever is hosting the tournament. They go to the pub and they come back the next day for the side events, and they still get 2 fun days of X-Wing, but at no point do they have to strain themselves because they can, and they're not harming anyone by leaving at the point where it's no longer possible for them to make it. And I think that's a really healthy way of running a tournament that means everyone's entertained, because I loved the second day. Like, I had a bad day on the second day of Yavin, but like, I enjoyed every minute of it because there was like, the side events are happening on the other tables and everyone's having fun. And then at the few remaining tables are everyone who's still in. And that's a really cool feeling. Like, you know, you get extra prizes and things for making it through to the second day. Like I have a stack of acrylic shield tokens for X-Wing that are exclusively for that second day of that event.
Cool. Yeah.
And so that's like, I own them for a reason. Like, I remember when the guy came around and gave us them, and that's like, you know, that was you know, and so everyone comes away feeling like they got something out of the whole weekend, which is something I know I wouldn't get out of this Age of Sigmar event because I don't have a chance, right?
Yeah.
Like, I'm going to be out of contention within like 3 games. And after that, it's just playing for the fun of it, which is fine. But in a marathon, anything's going to get boring.
Yeah.
So
it's a really good idea. I mean, I would go along and just play on the second day and just say, oh, I just want to play silly tournaments.
yeah, I think you can do that
just to
as
get used to it.
Yeah.
So if they ran kind of parallel little kind of, you know, just the hero combat games or just, you know, 750 pointers or dual game, you know, partners games where it's 2v2 or whatever they wanted to do on the second day. Like I would bring a box of my Stormcast to play on the second day for the casual stuff, just to get used to it and just to kind of get into the flow of it and what it's like to do this stuff with other people who are complete strangers. And then still see the Golden Demon, and, you know, it feels like that would be a more, you know, that I'd still get the gaming in, I'd still get the hobby in.
So we should say that we have decided that we're going to go to Warhammer Fest, but we're just going to go as show goers.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
So we'll go on to see the Golden Demon and kind of just say hello to Games Workshop, and just to hang out and just, I don't know, buy whatever beautiful
buy things.
Buy beautiful
Indulge
things.
the other great part of this hobby.
Absolutely.
But yeah, like, I totally agree. It's a daunting proposition at the moment. I don't know how we got onto that from the meta, but that's question 1.
Wow.
Down.
Good.
Done.
I hope we don't have many more.
I hope, Isaac, that you can forgive me for misusing the word orrery.
How do we get from orrery to that? Well done, us.
A veritable cosmos of tangents swirling around us in the manner of a swirly space thing.
Vortex, but nothing else. Only that description.
Exactly. Mitchell writes next, Dear Miniature Crate and Monthly Crowbar, my friends and I are deeply into all things Warhammer through the video games, board games and books, etc., and have been cautiously/lustily eyeing proper miniatures for some time now. Barring a Battle for Macragge starter kit, we have very little experience with the game itself and probably don't have the time or money to invest in proper armies. Hearing your discussion on Shadespire last episode, I was wondering if it would be possible to go out and get, say, any 6 hero minis and have some small 3v3 skirmishes using the AOS or 40k rules. Basically, I want to play something like Shadespire, but with any GW minis I want. Is this doable? Do you think it should be? Or does it defeat the purpose of the game and should we just stick to X-Wing? Really enjoying the new pod. I got into X-Wing because of Chris's stress and focus tournament diary on Shut Up and Sit Down, so it's all coming full circle now. Thanks, Mitchell from Toronto. That's interesting.
Yeah, it's a good question, actually. I'm not sure there is space for that precise thing.
There would be. So, you know how in the AOS starter box, the very first scenario it gets you to do is just Korgus Call versus Vander's Hammerhand. It's just 2 hero models hitting each other to teach you the rules. If they do what they are implying they'll do with the new 40k, open play will provide rules that allow you to do exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah.
At a very basic level. Because, I mean, fundamentally, those rules will be free. Presumably those, whatever they call war scrolls will be free.
Yeah.
So if you wanted to buy a couple of 40k models and make them fight, that will be doable without a big investment or needing to worry about army minimum requirements or whatever, right?
Yeah. Other than that, Shadespire sounds like the best bet by a long way. And obviously it's not out yet, but I mean, if you're interested in AOS at all and don't mind it not being a 40k thing, then that box, I imagine, isn't going to be hugely expensive given the number of models and the fact that they're going to want a large, you know, install base, to borrow a word from video games.
Yeah. Shadow War is the other side of this.
Yeah.
It's a little bit more complicated and the scenery requirement is the bigger thing,
isn't it? Yeah. I mean, that would have been my default answer if not for the scenery thing. And, you know, I used to play more time with cardboard boxes and things. Like, you can just build your own stuff. But in terms of just wanted to try out a few models, have a knockabout, then it's still going to be a bit of too much of an investment potentially.
Yeah. There's also games like Gore Chosen.
Oh, yeah.
Which was the standalone kind of like Khorne arena combat game they released. It comes with, it's a great value box, actually.
Yeah.
It's a 35 quid box that comes with 4 models individually, are about £18 each. So it's about half price on all those models.
They're really good models.
They're lovely models. All Khorne stuff. So like the Aspiring Deathbringer, the Exalted Deathbringer, the Slaughter Priest, and the Skullgrinder. How do I remember all these
That was
things?
impressive. Because you're truly Khorne. You pretend to be Tzeentch.
No, I understand a lot of fantasy nonsense words, like string them together. It's fine. And, I can tell you what the difference between a Skullgrinder and a Slaughter Priest is, and that's personally embarrassing. But yes, that might be a good set, because that's the standalone rule set for just making models fight in an arena. That might be a good fit as well while you wait. But yeah, you're right. Shadespire sounds like a good fit for this kind of thing.
Yeah.
The cool thing about all these things is, with AOS as it's currently operating, is if those models ended up forming the basis of a Khorne army, then you can do that. Like, there is a battalion in the new Khorne book called the Gore Chosen, which is I think it's an Exalted Deathbringer and any 7 other Khorne heroes forms one battalion.
Oh, cool.
Because that's what a Gore Chosen is. It's all of the favourite Gore people. The Gore Band.
I quite like Khorne.
I like Khorne as well. Khorne's my second favourite Chaos God, because it's kind of interesting going into the Khorne stuff after Tzeentch, because...
It's like tonal opposite.
Yeah, well, but like, Khorne is like the most honest Chaos God. Like, there's something duplicitous about Nurgle, because it's like, I'm giving you a great gift. Oh, I'm really sorry. The gift is Ebola. Oh, you didn't want this? But it's my favourite thing. With Tzeentch, it's like, promises, deceptions, trickery, aspirations, dreams, and it's all lies. You're a tentacle now. And Slaanesh is like, isn't pleasure great until it's too much? Whereas Khorne is like, there's no dishonesty about it. Like, what are we here for? Skulls? When do we want them? Skulls.
Yeah.
And that's
How many skulls do you have?
lots.
Yeah. Well done.
Exactly.
You're promoted.
It's a pure meritocracy. It's a rare example of pure meritocracy within the Warhammer pantheon. I mean, I say pure meritocracy based on a very specific set of skills, Liam Neeson style.
Yeah. Liam Neeson definitely skews Cornwards, I would say. Based on his recent
I have a very specific set of skulls. Let's not over tangent this one. Let's move on to the next question, which comes from Will, who writes, Dear Mini Monthlies, I only started listening to CNC a few months ago, so for you to add a minis pod was brilliant. I was also a teenage GWer, but lost touch with the hobby through university, etc. And since I moved to the USA a few years ago, I think I'm unlikely to find myself back there anytime soon. Why have GW never been so successful in the US? ? That's an interesting question by itself.
Yeah, and maybe initially because Core Warhammer and 40k is weirdly British in its origins, like its type of its brand of dystopian and fundamentally often pessimistic fantasy mixed with slapstick absurdity is, I don't know, it feels like a very kind of 80s British.
I think tonally, yeah. I think the other side of it is, I think at the same time that Warhammer was becoming a thing in the UK, Dungeons and Dragons was the craze in the US.
Oh, yeah.
Like, you can also say that, like, until a few years ago, D&D wasn't really a huge thing in the UK outside of niches, a bit like Warhammer is in the US. So the two, kind of had their own territories. Like, yeah. I say that because the way I've always understood Warcraft in the video games world is Warcraft is a marriage of the sort of the top layer of Warhammer with the tone of Dungeons and Dragons. Because Dungeons and Dragons has always been a lot sunnier. It's a lot more optimistic. And that Warcraft makes sense as a merger of sort of American fantasy sensibilities as communicated through Dungeons and Dragons with the war aspect of Warhammer.
And maybe the other thing is that, you know, Games Workshop has just focused more on the British market as, you know, and not really done as much to spread or market beyond these shores. And
I mean, it is huge in America, though, to be fair. Like,
it is now. I mean, Adepticon is enormous, and that's got just a huge 40k scene there. And so it's clearly, it does, you know, there is a huge market in America. But I don't feel, you know, if people are criticising Games Workshop for not being very good at marketing or very kind of, you know, inclusive or up to date with its marketing a few years ago, like that certainly applies doubly to territories outside of the UK, you know.
Yeah, true. The other side of this might well have been historically distribution. Because you and I know, having worked in the print media, that the reason for the rapid decline of print in the US as opposed to anywhere else in the world, really specifically Europe, I say anywhere else in the world, I mean Europe, is because distribution costs for physical things in America is just astronomically higher than everywhere else. So the sense of prints decline was exacerbated by the fact that it declined faster in the US than everywhere else. And I suspect, if what you were selling was a D&D core book in the 80s, it's a lot easier to get that out around America than it is to get boxes and boxes of metal miniatures, I suspect.
Yeah, good point. So, I mean, the GW's his approach historically has been put shops in every city.
Yeah.
And
wayward youth centres.
Yeah.
For the nerdiest youth.
Which is okay on a relatively smallish island like ours. But in America, that's a lot of office space.
It is. Anyway, the other half of Will's question, where he asks an actual question, is... Anyway, it's interesting to hear the new approach GW seem to be taking to their business model. Give away the rules and update them regularly, but continue to charge an arm and a leg. Charge an arm. Like Samus in Metroid. Continue to charge an arm and a leg for minis, paints, etc. How do you think this new approach is going to work for them? Should they lower the barrier to entry? It should lower the barrier to entry, but will it drive the price of figures even higher? Do you think it's related to their relaxing the IP franchise opportunities for more computer games in their universes? Tar for the pod, Will. And then PS, a third question. Are you Bath natives? If you were playing in the GW there in the mid-90s, you probably wiped the floor with my Bretonians or Space Marines at some point. Neither of us are Bath natives.
Nope.
I'm from Liverpool.
I'm from Birmingham.
And that's how that works. So I think maybe Will's got slightly the wrong end of the stick about how GW's business model has changed. Because definitely the rules being free mostly is a thing now. But also the miniatures have got a lot cheaper, but only through bundle deals, which is the trick, right? So
it's the gateway drug.
It is the gateway drug. So things like the start collecting boxes, which are £50 boxes that contain somewhere between 500 and 1,000 points worth of army, are very good value compared to the price of buying those things individually. I suppose the broader question here is, what is an arm and a leg? I'm not mean literally.
Yes, value subjective.
So yeah, you and I have both been back into this for, me it's not quite a year but actually before that, and pretty much on a year now for you, Tom, I reckon.
Just past.
Just getting there, right?
I would say, yep.
Do you have any sense of what material things are worth anymore?
I clearly have some sense because I still think things are expensive or not expensive when I look at them. But I know what my time is worth. I know how much time, how much pleasure I get out of these miniatures over that time. And to me, £30 for a box of 10 miniatures is easily worth that money. Of course, the paints are expensive as well. But, if I paid, with the paints, maybe £50, and if I, put those effort into those miniatures, I'll probably get 15, 20 hours if I play with them, potentially hundreds of hours pleasure out of them. And I've been collecting them for a year now, and I found that the investment has paid back for the amount of money put into it.
I agree. I find that coming from a computer games background, the hole that the £50 for a new game, AAA game, seems to vanish into is less pronounced to me. I assumed that I would feel guilty about, 30, 40 quid spent on models, but because you'd see them on a shelf and go, I spent 20 quid on these plastic men. And then you get a takeout, and that is £20, and that vanishes. Or you go out for a drink, a couple of drinks, and that's £20. I'm not saying that there aren't more worthy uses. I'm saying it is the most worthy use of £20 on planet Earth, because it absolutely obviously isn't. But I find it easier than I would have thought to justify that as a use of my disposable income in a way that will make me I'll get a lot out of over time.
Yeah, for sure. And I, in terms of the cost of it, I know nothing about miniatures production. I have no idea what the margins are. I have no idea, people online, you'll see a lot saying that Games Workshop stuff is a rip-off, but their plastic molds are fucking amazing. They're some of the best in the world. And you do pay for that quality. And if you don't want to spend that much on a miniatures game, there are miniatures games that will cost you £15.
A lot less, yeah.
Yeah, it's way less if you want to do that. It's whether you want to pay for this to get into this fantasy and to paint this sort of model,
I think it's the thing that's, he mentions the computer games, but for me it's it's the thing that brings miniatures games into sharp relief is that, like, if I wanted to play a strategy game that looks nice tomorrow, I can play a computer game. I mean, Dawn of War's out really soon, right? Like, if I want to play a Warhammer computer game, I can do that.
Yeah.
There is a specific pleasure to owning models. Like, I think the notion that, the models cost an arm and a leg is definitely true, but that is more of a hard thing to swallow if you feel that that cost is the thing barring you from access to this game you want to play. Obviously this is very specific to me personally, but like, because the pleasure of owning and painting the models comes first, it's almost like we found out today playing Prosperate for the first time. The game is the bonus. The game is the thing of like, oh, we spent ages making these tiny plastic people that look cool. And now we get to play a game with interesting rules with them. It's definitely the type of player you are. I think honestly, if what you're interested in is strategy and becoming a better strategic gamer, I think you should get into computer games and possibly also get into, I think, an X-Wing is a good bet for that because it's a little bit more accessible in that regard. Like, maybe this whole pod I've been orbiting around saying I don't know if I would recommend Games Workshop games to people as purely competitive outlets because I don't think that's where their strengths lie, really. I think that's the thing they've always struggled with the most. Whereas what they're very good at, as you say, is making amazing looking models and making them fun to paint.
Yeah. And there's giving you a framework to show off those models with each other via games. And obviously there is a competitive element to it because it sustains these huge tournaments, but that's not for me where the value lies monetarily. Yeah,
but like you say, like when we talk about those kinds of events that appeal to us the most, it's always a coming together of lots of different disciplines. There's a prominent painting element. There is a prominent playing element as well, and a display element, almost like a performance element to it. It's this combination of things. It's somewhere between a war game and a cosplay contest.
Yeah.
And that's unique and brilliant. But if it is all about the strategy to you, then I think there are better uses of your resources. If it's not, and if it's about that coming together of different things, then I think this is a perfectly good use of £20.
Yeah, for sure.
Our final question comes from Chimp, who's repeatedly beaten you at Age of Sigmar.
Absolutely. I don't think I've won a game against him. Oh, I've won one.
Okay.
Only just.
He writes, Dear Star Souls and Stormgladii, this is going to be extremely out of date by now, but while I agree that the changes to the big offenders in X-Wing metagame are good, do you feel it's ultimately damaging to their buy ships for the cards business model? He says, looking at epic ships, auto thrusters and crackshot, which are examples of upgrades that only came with specific onerous purchases. I always thought this was pretty rough for tournament X-Wing players, but there's a whiff of the ridiculous about having to buy a £90 expansion to be able to take Palp Aces list, which is Palpatine Aces, to a Fantasy Flight event in order to own a card that you won't actually use at the table because all of the printed text is now incorrect. The Raider, for example, was already being devalued by the TIE Advanced Prototype release, and the Inquisitor being what if Vader, but better. I know technically you're not buying a ship for the cards, but you're getting a plastic ship as well, but no one gives a shit about the Kirax fighter. It doesn't even look like a Star Wars ship. Thanks for being a miniatures podcast without terrible music, bants, or politics. Love, Chimp. P.S. Tom, I'd love to know how it feels to cheat in list construction and still lose. Do you want to answer that last bit first?
Yeah, so I played a game recently against Chimp where it was a really good game, actually. It was super close. I think it was 4 places of power where there are 4 positions on the board that you need to seize. One is in your opponent's territory, and that's worth 4 points. There are 2 side ones which are equidistant from each force, and they're worth 2 points. The one in your own territory, I think, is worth 1. So it's about kind of striking out and, if you gamble a bit and capture your opponent's objective, then you get loads of points. So I played this great game, and I took the Hammer Strike Force, which is some prosecutors that can lightning strike down retributors. I used that to seize Chimp's point in my first turn. He gave me the first turn. So I flew them across, sat these guys down, and the game unfolded from there. And I had these fulminators that I put in, the Iseric realm, or whatever. And when you do that, you can roll for them every turn, and on a 3+ they turn up. And I kept rolling for them, and, turn 1, they didn't come down, which is, I was like, oh, a bit of a shame, but it's fine, it gives more flexibility. Turn 2, they didn't come down. I was like, this is probably going to be kind of a problem because all my guys are getting overwhelmed, and Chimp running a Flesh Eater Corpse force had just huge model count, and model count is what counts for capturing these objectives. The Stormcaster being slowly subsumed. And the third turn, I think they did come down then. By then it was far too late. Like almost all of my guys were dead.
We're ready.
And it's like, we've got this, guys. Oh, where are you? Why are we alone? But then afterwards, when we checked the sheets, I realized that I'd taken the wrong sheet from my list in Azir, which is the AOS app that lets you build things. So I said, I'll just pick this 1,500 point list and I'll run with that. But it was actually more like a 2,000 point list. And a lot of that cost for those formulators, who did fuck all because they didn't come down until the very end of the game and, they failed to influence anything. So I was definitely overpointed. But thanks to my own stupidity, the extra points did literally nothing for the most part. I still lost though, but it was a really interesting game because I scored massively in the opening turn because of the Hammer Strike Force, and I owned 3 points out of the 4 for like 1 or 2, and then slowly just like the tide turned and I just didn't have the model count to sustain it. And then by the end of turn 3, going into turn 4, it was like obvious that we'd lost, and we both had too much whiskey anyway, so we stopped. Good times.
Good. So, this broader question's about to clarify, if you play X-Wing Miniatures game, you buy all of the things they sell for X-Wing Miniatures are ships, pre-painted ships they sell, and each ship comes with cards for that ship, from pilot cards to upgrade cards. It's the upgrade cards that could potentially be used on ships that aren't the ship you've bought it for. And in the most onerous cases, there are ships that you might buy that are quite bad, like the Star Viper, but who come with upgrades that are basically essential for other ships. So if you want to fly an Imperial TIE Interceptor, you desperately need an upgrade called Auto Thrusters, which only comes with the Star Viper, which is a scum ship that you probably wouldn't use for anything else at the moment. Although I know from basically like chewing the ear off, that's a phrase, right? Is it?
Close enough.
Talking the ear off, there's no chewing. Talking the ear off one of X-Wing's lead designers at Star Wars Celebration. Hopefully the Star Viper will get some love, but nonetheless, there's a lot of kind of buying models you don't necessarily want for upgrades, you need something else. And it within the context of a game of I say limited scope, but like X-Wing is a finite game in a way that Warhammer can sometimes feel like an infinite game because you're always building to a 100-point limit pretty much. It's ultimately not that bad, but I say that as someone who owns everything, which is nuts. So
that's the thing that I struggled with X-Wing was like, I went into it with perhaps quite a Warhammer mindset where I was like, I want to build this force.
Yeah.
So I want to build a weird scum force, and you just can't do that without buying loads of rebel ships.
Yeah.
Loads of Imperial
ships.
Ships.
For example, like, I will tell people, like, I don't play scum. But if you look to my shelf, you'll notice every scum ship.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So the business model works.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a weird system, particularly if you come to it from Warhammer. It's not so bad if you consider that, because all upgrade cards are ultimately taxed. In friendly games, proxying cards is very common, where you just say, I've got this card and here's what it does. And we just assume that you do. You pay the points cost for it. You don't need it. The only time you need the physical card, and this is why Chimp mentions Fantasy Flight Games tournaments particularly, is in official tournaments, you need the actual card. So that's it's a legit thing. The particular example he calls out is, one of the most sort of contentious, Imperial cards for a long time was Palpatine himself, the Emperor, as a crew card.
Yeah.
Which has been actually not changed that much, but in order to change him a little bit, they basically had to reword him completely. So the card as printed is currently wrong.
So that invalidates it in competitive context.
You can use it in a competitive context, but it has the new wording. Okay. But you still need the physical card, which is a weird situation to end up in.
Yeah, that's really weird.
Particularly because that card comes with one of the most expensive X-Wing expansions, which is the Imperial Raider, which is the massive Imperial ship.
It's a capital ship, right?
Yeah, it's like a mini capital ship, like a frigate. Prominently featured in the Battlefront 2 trailer, despite being invented for X-Wing, the miniatures game.
Rad.
Yeah.
Feeding back into the
universe.
Yeah,
it's all looping back. He also says that the Raider purchase was devalued by the fact that, the Inquisitor who flies the TIE Advanced prototype being Vader but better. That's actually kind of incorrect. Because Vader has one of the best pilot skills in the game. He's just in a ship that's not very good. Whereas the Inquisitor is far more fragile and far less versatile, but just in a ship that's got a slightly better dial because it has a green hard one. That's not interesting to anybody outside of this. The broader question is about that practice of selling upgrade cards as via expansions. Like, I think the interesting thing about X-Wing is because the cards are what make or break the game in terms of balance, really, dials to a lesser extent. They either have to give themselves the freedom to FAQ stuff quite substantially, which means functionally changing on the wording on cards that have already been printed. A problem Warhammer doesn't have, because Warhammer, you kind of pull the rules. I mean, obviously the books have already been printed, but the app is out there. There's a sense of fluidity about the whole thing, whereas the cards in X-Wing feel very physical and definite.
And all the Warhammer apps and the rules are free. They're all PDFs you can just download.
Yeah, absolutely. However, I think it would be arrogant of any designer to say that no one ever prints rules wrong. And I think they've hit problems with X-Wing where the things they definitely can't easily reprint or FAQ cause the biggest problems for the game. So the example of this is like, the thing they can never change is a dial, because a dial is a physical thing that comes with the ship that shows you what maneuvers that ship can do. And in the most pointed recent cases, the things that have really hurt the metagame for X-Wing over the last year, the things that have gone wrong aren't really the upgrades, although they're part of it. It's the dial. Like the Jumpmaster, which is the expansion that really hurt the game. You can say a lot of things about that ship and the upgrades that came with it and the reason it was a problem. But the thing that makes it overpowered is its dial. And that's the thing you cannot change. You need to literally take a red pen and draw some red over a few of the things on its dial. And they could issue an FAQ update that said that from now on, the right-hand turns on the Jumpmaster dial are red, which they probably should be. But there's no way to physically change the dials that are in players' hands. Whereas for whatever reason, the notion that the wording on a card could be altered by an FAQ is easier for people to internalize, because it's not like a physical game bit.
Right.
You're not like editing the model, which is almost where they're getting at with the dials thing. And maybe that's the final Rubicon. Like, I asked them when I was out there at Star Wars Celebration, like, do you feel like FAQs are going to be enough in the long run? Do you think you would ever need to do a ban list for cards?
Right.
Or ships? And they didn't answer so definitively about that, but the assumption is that they feel that FAQ changes, particularly as they feel more liberty to like substantially reword things, is enough to keep the game balanced. And by all accounts, it might. Like, for example, they're putting out a new Scum large an epic ship pretty soon that comes with a reissued version of the Seek, which is a cousin to the Kirax that Chimp doesn't like, also from Star Wars Galaxies. They're both ships from Star Wars Galaxies. Which that ship has recently had some rewording to some of its key upgrades. And that ship is coming with new versions of those upgrades that have the correct text on them.
Okay.
The other thing they can do is they often use tournament kits that have like prizes for specific seasonal or quarterly tournaments often come with alternate art versions of upgrades. And I think that would potentially be a very good vector for them to distribute correct wording versions of those cards. Right. So if they were to release an Emperor Palpatine card through, and they've often done this as a way of distributing cards that are otherwise quite hard to get. So if they were to do this to distribute a new version of the Palpatine card that happened to have, the new wording on it, that would be a really good way of doing it. So they already got this mechanism. They already did this. Like, this exact scenario existed for Rebels until relatively recently, because one of the most important crew cards for Rebels was C-3PO, and he was only available through the Tantive 4 expansion, which is again the massive Corellian Corvette, costs a lot of money. Yeah. Until they made an alternate art C-3PO a tournament reward that everyone got if you entered a tournament in this particular quarter. And so there are a billion of them out there now. It crushed the secondary market for that card overnight, which is one of the reasons they did it. Right. And now, actually, like, most, like, people who have not the official art C-3PO, not the alternate art C-3PO, use that instead, because that's the rare one. Right. The one that comes with the expensive ship, not the alternate art version. So, you know, there's totally precedent for them doing this, like relieving the pressure on the secondary market for certain upgrade cards by putting them out as tournament rewards. So I think, I don't know, ultimately I quite like X-Wing system, and I enjoy that there's this sort of excitement when a new ship comes out of discovering where it fits and how its cards affect everything else. And because it's such a controlled environment, it hasn't, apart from, like, even when the balance has gone wrong, it's nowhere near the territory that Warhammer ends up in, where the rules are a lot fuzzier and a lot more analog, where things can just fuck each other up across the game without too much forethought. Like,
yeah, I guess it's interesting to try and answer the question in the same way that we did the previous question, where it's like, how can you spend 20 quid on a box of models? And like, for us, there's the hobby drawer, but maybe like if you're really competitive and it's one of the best competitive board games in the world, which surely it is, even though it has its problems.
Yeah, I think so.
And that's what you want to do. You want to compete in that context. Then maybe that card is worth £60 to you.
Yeah, I think so. So no war game is cheap, unfortunately. Like X-Wing's expense comes from the fact that not the model count on the board, but the collection you build up. I've got folders full of X-Wing upgrade cards that are where the real value of my collection lies, pretty much, because that's what gives me the freedom to build things. The great thing about the X-Wing system, I would say, to defend it, is that once you've built that collection of ships, you have complete flexibility within that metagame. Like I say, I don't play Scum, but that's partly because of a dispositional alignment towards a different faction.
Yeah.
I can play Scum. If something changes in the metagame and I have an idea, I can execute that idea. I can't do that with any other wargame I play. I can't do that with any Warhammer game. I can't just decide, I know this competitive season, I'm going to play Sylvaneth. Because that's
hundreds of pounds.
Like hundreds of pounds, hundreds of hours of hobby investment to move a giant cumbersome hobby boat around. Whereas with X-Wing, with my collection, which is admittedly in the hundreds of pounds, I can make any possible thing that's possible in that game.
Yeah.
And play it. Which is a different way of perceiving the value of your collection. You don't get the value of the time you spend painting things and making them your own, but you do get flexibility within the game system, which you absolutely don't get otherwise. Does that mean that ships shouldn't come up with the upgrades that they need? Absolutely not. And to be fair to FFG, they've gotten a lot better at that. Like the examples that Chimp cites, the Kirax, the Star Viper, the Raider are all from a couple of years ago. More recently, ships have come with more of the things you need to make them good. And if you want to make them perfect, maybe you mix something in from a different kit. But the First Order TIE Fighter is a great example of a ship that comes with everything you need to play it completely optimally. So both exist. And I feel like I should be nice to Fantasy Flight because I was mean about the game I didn't like. That is the last question we've had for Miniatures Monthly this month.
Oh my.
What a pod.
Yeah,
what a
wow.
long pod. Yeah.
Took a lot of ground.
So we'll be back at the end of May, maybe even with a little bit of flavour from Warhammer Fest in Coventry.
Yeah, hopefully.
If you would like to send us a question for a future episode of the podcast, you can do so by emailing miniatures@crateandcrowbar.com. I wanted to give a shout out once again to Mike Debenham, who composed our theme music and very kindly for this month, composed a cleaned up remix. You might not notice the difference, but thank you for the additional effort because it's awesome. And so are you. It's also worth mentioning that this podcast is made possible by the Crate and Crowbar Patreon, which runs across all the things we do at Crate and Crowbar, spanning out from the core PC gaming podcast. More information on our Patreon is available at patreon.com/Crate and Crowbar, and thanks to all of our backers who have let us do miniatures rambles once a month. Yeah, we'll be back in 4 weeks. Thanks for listening, everybody.
Thank you.
Tom, that was...
Got to do that.
Did you forget?
I did.